Think history is boring? Think again. Forget dusty books. Imagine the smells, the struggles, the surprising joys of just living day to day in medieval times. It wasn't always knights and castles. Everyday life was a wild story all its own. Settle in and let's uncover the past, one fascinating detail at a time. If you find yourself drifting off with curiosity, please like and subscribe. Imagine you wake up, not in your comfortable bed, but on a straw-filled mattress in a small, drafty house. The year is 1348, the heart of the medieval period, and life is drastically different from what you know. Forget instant access to clean water, central heating, or even basic sanitation. Surviving everyday life in this era required resilience, adaptability, and a healthy dose of luck. The looming shadow of the Black Death adds a layer of uncertainty to every sunrise. Welcome to the mid-14th century, where the simple act of living is an intricate dance with nature, disease, and the rigid structure of society. We'll explore the surprising details of how people managed to thrive, or at least endure, without the comforts we take for granted. Darkness is thick, heavy, pressing in from all sides. It's a familiar darkness, the kind that exists before the first hint of dawn has even considered breaking the horizon. Sleep has not been a luxurious escape, but rather a necessary, often fitful, surrender to exhaustion. And now, consciousness begins its slow, unwelcome return, creeping into the edges of your mind, like the damp chill that seems to permeate everything. There is no gentle awakening here. No soft sunlight filtering through curtains. Instead, the first sensation is often the cold. It's a penetrating cold, one that settles deep in your bones, leaching warmth from your body throughout the long night. It finds its way through the thin, rough-spun tunic you sleep in, through the threadbare woolen blanket if you are fortunate enough to possess one. Your joints ache with a dull, persistent throb, your hips, your back, your shoulders, protesting the surface upon which you lie. Forget memory foam, forget pocket springs or ergonomic support. Your bed is a simple sack, likely made of coarse canvas or burlap, stuffed with straw. It's lumpy, uneven. Over weeks and months, the straw has become compressed under your weight, flattened in some areas, prickly and sharp in others. It offers little comfort, merely a slight buffer against the cold, hard earth floor beneath. With time, the straw also absorbs the dampness from the ground and the air, becoming musty, sometimes even slightly moldy. It rustles loudly with every small movement, a constant reminder of its basic nature. And you are not alone in this straw, sharing your meager warmth. Our tiny, unseen companions. Fleas are a common reality, perhaps lice, too, thriving in the bedding, in clothes, in hair. You might feel their occasional irritating bites, a persistent itch that joins the chorus of discomforts. There's no escaping them entirely. They are simply a part of this close-quartered existence. Forget the crisp, clean scent of freshly laundered Egyptian cotton or smooth silk. The smell here is far more elemental. Breathe deeply, if you dare. The air in this small, single room is heavy, stagnant, thick with the accumulated scents of the night. There's the pervasive, slightly sour odor of unwashed human bodies, your own, your family members huddled close by for shared warmth. Packed together, perhaps 4 or 5, even more souls in this confined space, the air grows stale quickly. Mingled with this is the sharp ammoniac tang drifting from the corner where the precious family animals, perhaps some chickens, maybe a piglet or even a calf in the harshest weather, huddle against the cold. They were brought inside for safety from predators and thieves, and their warmth, however pungent, is a small benefit in the frigid nights. Their smells, their rustlings, their occasional soft noises are an intrinsic part of the domestic soundscape and smellscape. Overlaying these immediate scents is the lingering odor of wood smoke from yesterday's cooking fire, now cold and ashy, that clings to the walls, the thatch overhead, and everything within the hut. Add to this the smell of the damp earth floor itself, perhaps the faint unpleasant whiff of nearby waste, or the general mustiness of damp belongings. Ventilation is minimal. There are likely no glass windows. If openings exist, they are small, simple holes in the walls, perhaps covered by wooden shutters, thick cloth, or animal hide, all tightly secured against the night's chill, drafts, and any perceived dangers lurking outside. Fresh air is a luxury not often afforded within these walls. Your eyes might flutter open, adjusting slowly, but there isn't much to see in the pre-dawn gloom. The single room that serves as kitchen, living space, sleeping quarters, and sometimes even workshop is shrouded in deep shadow. Perhaps a faint grayish light begins to seep through a crack in the wooden door, or a gap in the wattle and daub walls. These walls are rough, a simple framework of wood interwoven with branches, wattle, coated with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and dung. The roof above might be thatched with straw or reeds, offering shelter but also home to more insects and susceptible to leaks. The floor, as mentioned, is likely packed earth. Cold, perpetually slightly damp, uneven, it will be cold underfoot when the time comes to rise. You can feel the density of the space around you, the close presence of others, hear the rhythmic, sometimes sputtering snores of your father or mother nearby. A younger sibling might cough, a low, chesty sound that echoes slightly in the damp air. A worrying reminder of the prevalence of respiratory ailments. Someone shifts on their own straw pallet, the rustle sharp and distinct in the relative quiet. Beyond the thin walls, the world outside begins its own slow awakening, hinted at by subtle sounds. A distant dog might bark. The chickens sharing your space might begin to stir and shuffle softly, a cow lowing from a nearby byre. These are the familiar, everyday sounds that filter through the walls, blending with the intimate sounds of your sleeping family. And then, the sound that truly anchors the morning, faint at first, then growing clearer, more insistent, the distant, resonant clang of the church bell. It tolls, perhaps signaling matins, the first prayers of the day for the monks or the priest. For you and the vast majority, it is less a call to formal prayer and more the undeniable auditory signal that the brief respite of night is over. It is the clock by which the community lives and works. It means the day, with all its relentless demands, has officially begun. There is no gentle transition, no warm shower awaits, no thermostat to adjust. Sleep hasn't truly refreshed you, has merely held exhaustion at bay for a few hours. Every muscle seems stiff, reluctant. Your back complains loudly about the uneven surface. Your neck aches. The damp chill feels like it has seeped into your very marrow. Getting up requires a conscious act of will. Pushing aside the heavy, scratchy blanket feels like shedding a vital layer of protection against the biting cold. The air hits your exposed skin instantly, sharp and uncomfortable. You sit up slowly, the straw rustling beneath you, perhaps dislodging a few more unseen critters. The smells seem stronger now, more present. The dim light reveals the cramped, cluttered reality of your home. This is the medieval morning. Not bright, not cheerful, not comfortable. It is simply the necessary end of the night's relative stillness and the unavoidable beginning of another day's labor and survival. The struggle begins not with the first task, but with the simple, aching act of waking up in a world devoid of modern comforts, surrounded by the raw, unfiltered sensations of life centuries ago. The church bell continues its solemn call, a rhythm beaten into the very fabric of your existence. Time to rise, time to face the day. Imagine for a moment your familiar bathroom. Clean, private, perhaps even pleasantly scented. You have access to running water, soft towels, and most crucially, a flushing toilet connected to a hidden sanitation system. Now, gently allow that modern image to dissolve into the past. The daily, necessary act of answering nature's call during medieval times was a profoundly different experience, stripped bare of the comfort, privacy, and cleanliness we almost universally take for granted today. It was simply a biological necessity dealt with through far more rudimentary means. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants laboring in rural villages or isolated farms, dedicated facilities were virtually non-existent. Inside their small, often single-room homes, a simple bucket or a ceramic pot, the ubiquitous chamber pot, served as the primary receptacle, especially during the cold, dark hours of the night or for the infirm. Using it offered minimal privacy, often occurring within earshot or even sight of other family members sharing the cramped living space. This was simply the accepted norm. When the chamber pot was full, or during daylight hours, the solution was typically found just outside the dwelling. There wasn't a designated outhouse in most cases. Instead, waste was often deposited in a shallow ditch dug nearby at the edge of a field, or quite commonly added directly to the household dung heap. This midden was a vital feature of rural life, a slowly decomposing pile where animal manure, human waste, kitchen scraps, and other organic matter were combined over time. Necessity trumped squeamishness. This dung heap wasn't merely a place to discard unwanted material. It was an essential part of the agricultural cycle. After decomposing for a period, this rich mixture would be painstakingly collected and spread across the fields as fertilizer. It returned vital nutrients to the soil, helping to ensure the success of the crops that sustained the family and community. In this way, human waste, far from being flushed away, was integrated back into the very process of food production, a direct and earthy cycle unknown to most modern societies. Life in the burgeoning medieval towns and cities presented unique and significantly more challenging sanitation problems. Houses were built close together, often sharing walls, with narrow streets and alleys winding between them. Private gardens or yards were rare luxuries. This density made finding a discreet outdoor spot incredibly difficult. While chamber pots remained the standard indoor solution for almost everyone, from wealthy merchants to humble artisans, the pressing issue became the disposal of the collected waste in such crowded conditions. The most common, and unfortunately most visible method of disposal was, startlingly direct, emptying the contents of the chamber pots straight out of an upper window or doorway and into the street below. While some streets might have had a central channel or rudimentary gutters, these were often little more than open drains, frequently choked with mud, animal droppings, discarded food, and other refuse. Walking through a medieval town required constant vigilance, not just for uneven footing, but also for what might rain down from above. In many towns, particularly in places like Scotland and parts of France, a customary warning cry would precede the unpleasant deluge. Shouts like "Garde loose," likely derived from the French phrase "Garde leo," meaning "watch out for the water," offered pedestrians a brief, urgent moment to flatten themselves against a building or leap into a doorway for safety. This practice contributed immensely to the notorious stench and pervasive filth of medieval urban environments, effectively turning many streets into public sewers. Recognizing the scale of the problem, some larger, more organized towns and cities did attempt to provide communal facilities. These public latrines varied in design. Some were simple wooden structures built directly over rivers or streams, relying on the current to carry the waste away, inevitably polluting the water downstream. Others were purpose-built structures containing rows of seats, often just planks with holes cut into them, positioned over a large cesspit dug beneath. Privacy was minimal to non-existent in these places. Using these public latrines was often a communal affair. Users would sit side by side, sometimes engaging in conversation, conducting business, or simply tending to their needs in full view and earshot of others. The modern concept of the bathroom as a place of absolute personal privacy simply did not exist in the same way. Modesty had different boundaries, and bodily functions were often treated with a matter-of-factness born of necessity and the lack of alternatives. These communal facilities were often foul-smelling and infrequently cleaned. Those living in castles or large manor houses, the nobility, clergy, and their retainers, often had access to slightly more sophisticated arrangements known as gararobes. These were essentially small rooms or closets built into the thickness of the castle's outer walls or protruding outwards. A hole in the floor or a seat opened onto a vertical shaft or chute that channeled waste down the exterior wall. It would typically empty into the castle moat, a river, or a dedicated cesspit dug at the base of the wall, hopefully far from the water supply. The name garderobe literally translates to wardrobe or keeping place for robes. One persistent theory for this name suggests that valuable garments were sometimes hung in these latrine closets. The ammonia fumes rising from the waste pit below were believed to act as a natural deterrent against moths, fleas, and other damaging insects. While offering more seclusion than a public latrine, the garderobe was not immune to odor issues, especially depending on the wind direction or during cleaning of the pit below. And what about cleaning oneself after the act? Modern toilet paper was centuries away. People relied on readily available natural materials. For the rural poor, this meant handfuls of leaves. Broad leaves like dock were apparently favored, moss gathered from damp walls or trees, handfuls of grass, hay, or straw. Smooth stones or even discarded mussel or oyster shells found near coastal areas could also be employed. Resourcefulness was key, using whatever the local environment provided freely. For those with slightly more means, scraps of old linen or woolen cloth, rags, might be used. These might even be washed and reused, a practice that sounds alarming to modern hygiene standards, but was a practical reality then. In some contexts, particularly echoing older Roman customs perhaps found in monasteries or very wealthy households, a communal xylospongium or tersorium, a natural sea sponge attached to a stick, might have been used, rinsed in a bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses. Crucially, the routine practice of washing hands with soap and water after using the latrine or chamber pot was largely absent. Soap existed, but it was often relatively expensive and typically reserved for laundry or occasional full-body washing, not for frequent hand hygiene. The link between invisible germs on hands and the spread of disease was completely unknown. Hands that had handled waste might soon after handle food, care for children, or prepare medicines, contributing significantly to the prevalence of illness. The cumulative effect of these practices was an environment, especially in towns, that was often overwhelmingly foul-smelling and visibly dirty. Streets slick with waste, buzzing flies, contaminated water sources, and the constant proximity to human and animal excrement were daily realities. Concepts of sanitation and hygiene as we understand them were nascent at best. Avoiding filth and the diseases it fostered was a constant struggle. one that shaped daily life and contributed to the relatively short life expectancies of the era. So the next time you enter your modern, private, sanitary bathroom, take a quiet moment. Recall the world of the chamber pot, the pungent dung heap, the hurried cry of Gardyloo, the communal latrine, and the simple handful of moss. The mundane, effortless act of using a toilet and washing your hands is a profound luxury, a silent testament to centuries of advancements in public health, technology, and our understanding of the world. It marks a vast distance traveled from the everyday realities of medieval life. Having surfaced from the relative oblivion of sleep, leaving behind the lumpy straw pallet and the lingering chill of the pre-dawn air, your awareness turns towards the day ahead. Before the relentless cycle of physical labor begins under the growing light, there is the need to break the fast. It's essential to set aside any modern picture of a cheerful, varied morning meal. Forget crisp cereals, forget fruit platters, forget toasted delights or cooked breakfasts. The first meal of the day for a medieval peasant wasn't about pleasure or choice, it was about necessity, it was fuel. Simple, often monotonous, but vital fuel. The centerpiece of this essential refueling, the dish most likely simmering gently over the embers of the hearth, was pottage. This wasn't a distinct recipe, but rather a kind of perpetual stew, the absolute foundation of the common diet. Imagine a large cauldron, blackened by constant use, suspended over the fire. This pot was rarely emptied completely. Instead, it was constantly topped up, simmering away for hours, sometimes days, a continuous source of warm sustenance. However uninspired it might seem to us now, it represented security against hunger. What found its way into this ever-present pottage? The base was almost always grains, humble oats, sturdy barley, perhaps rye, depending on the region and the harvest. These would cook down slowly, providing bulk and calories. Dried legumes, like peas and beans, were crucial additions, offering valuable protein and substance, especially when meat was scarce. Into this thick foundation would go whatever vegetables were in season from the small garden plot, or what could be foraged: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, perhaps carrots or parsnips. Wild herbs might add a hint of flavor. The cooking method itself defined the dish. New ingredients were simply added to whatever remained in the pot from the day before, mingling and cooking down with the old. Yesterday's leftovers weren't discarded, they formed the very base of today's meal, ensuring nothing was wasted. This prolonged, gentle simmering rendered everything incredibly soft, breaking down fibers and melding flavors into a thick, porridge-like consistency. It would then be ladled, steaming reassuringly into simple bowls made of wood or rough earthenware, ready to be consumed. How did it taste and feel to eat? Its flavor profile was predominantly earthy, a direct reflection of its humble soil-grown ingredients. Salt was a valuable commodity, often used sparingly if available at all, meaning pottage could be incredibly bland to our modern palate. Texturally, it was typically thick, soft, almost mushy, requiring minimal effort to chew, perhaps a benefit for those with poor dental health. It could be thicker or thinner depending on how much water or stock was added. Its primary virtues were simple: it was hot, it was filling, and it offered vital warmth on a cold morning. Served alongside the pottage, almost without fail, was bread. But again, it's crucial to dismiss any modern image of light, airy loaves. The bread of the medieval peasant was typically dense, heavy, and dark in color. It was usually made from the less desirable, coarser grains like rye, barley, or maslin, a common mixture of wheat and rye. Often the grain was coarsely ground and the bread baked using whole flour, retaining the bran and germ, which made it nutritionally valuable but also gave it a rough texture and contributed to its density. This bread was often baked infrequently, perhaps only once a week or even less often in some households, due to fuel scarcity or lack of access to a communal oven. Consequently, it quickly became stale, hard, and tough. Eating it required significant effort from the teeth and jaws. It wasn't generally savored for its delightful crust or soft crumb. It was a functional necessity, a dense source of calories, a tool for soaking up the pottage, something substantial to gnaw on to appease the persistent pangs of hunger. Stale bread was a familiar trial, not a welcome friend. Sometimes a particularly thick slice of this coarse day-old bread, perhaps 4 days old and quite solid, would serve a dual purpose as an improvised plate known as a trencher. The pottage, or perhaps a rare serving of sauce or gravy if fortune allowed, would be ladled directly onto this slab of bread. The diner would eat the food from the top. Afterwards, depending on their level of hunger and how palatable the soaked bread remained, they might consume the trencher itself. Alternatively, it might be tossed to the dogs or collected as alms for the very poor, ensuring even the plate wasn't wasted. During lean times, periods of poor harvest, or outright famine, The quality and composition of this essential bread could deteriorate significantly. To make the precious grain supply last longer, millers or bakers might resort to adulterating the flour with various extenders. Adding ground-dried peas or beans was common. However, in truly desperate circumstances, less savory and sometimes non-nutritious materials like sawdust, ground tree bark, chalk, or even dried powdered clay might be mixed into the dough simply to create bulk and the illusion of sufficiency. And what was consumed alongside this simple fare? It almost certainly wasn't water. The standard beverage for nearly everyone in medieval Europe from childhood onwards was ale or small beer. This wasn't the potent, often bitter, hop-infused beer of modern times. Medieval ale was typically quite low in alcohol content, often cloudy with yeast and grain particles, but it provided calories and hydration. Crucially, it was generally safer to drink than water drawn from easily contaminated sources. Water sources like wells, rivers, and streams, especially near settlements, were highly vulnerable to pollution from human and animal waste, runoff from fields, and effluent from various crafts like tanning or butchery. Without any understanding of germ theory, people learned through harsh experience that drinking water could frequently lead to debilitating or fatal illnesses like dysentery, cholera, or typhoid fever. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, effectively sterilized it, killing most harmful microorganisms and making ale the healthier default choice. Notice the significant absences on this typical peasant breakfast table. Meat is a rarity. Perhaps a tiny bit of bacon fat flavoring the pottage, or a scrap of salted pork saved for a special occasion, but daily meat consumption was beyond the means of most. Dairy products like cheese or butter were also infrequent luxuries, requiring surplus milk from a cow or goats, animals many families couldn't afford or sustain. Even eggs, while potentially available from backyard chickens, were often more valuable as items to sell or barter at the local market. So this breakfast of champions truly was a champion only in its capacity to provide the basic energy needed to survive another day of demanding physical toil. It was fundamentally monotonous. The same core ingredients, grains, legumes, seasonal roots, formed the basis of meals day after day, week after week. While providing essential carbohydrates, the diet could easily be deficient in vital vitamins, minerals, and high-quality protein, particularly during the long winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. It was a menu dictated by sheer necessity and the rhythm of the seasons. There was no ceremony associated with this meal, no leisurely enjoyment. It was consumed efficiently, perhaps standing or sitting on a simple stool near the hearth, before the demands of the day called everyone away to the fields, the forest, or the workshop. It served its purpose, to fill the belly and provide strength. A profoundly functional start to the day, worlds away from the choice, comfort, and culinary pleasure we associate with breakfast today. Just the steady rhythm of pottage, hard bread, and weak ale, the humble, essential engine of medieval daily life. When we consider clothing in our modern lives, our minds often wander through images of diverse styles, overflowing closets, seasonal trends, and the careful expression of personal identity. It's a world of choice and change. Now, let this familiar landscape gently fade. For the average person navigating daily life in medieval times, particularly within the vast peasant majority, the entire concept of a wardrobe was fundamentally different, stripped down to its most basic essence. Forget fashion, think function, durability, and sheer necessity. Often, this meant owning only one, perhaps two complete sets of clothing to wear day in, day out. The absolute cornerstone of this severely limited collection, the fundamental garment for both men and women across much of medieval Europe, was the tunic. Picture a simple garment, often constructed in a basic T-shape to minimize fabric waste. For men, it typically reached somewhere between the hips and the knees. For women, it was usually longer, perhaps falling to the mid-calf or even the ankles. Made with straight cuts of cloth and minimal tailoring, it was designed for practicality above all else. This single garment served as the primary layer for work, rest, and social interaction, a true all-purpose covering. The materials used dictated much about the experience of wearing these clothes. Wool was overwhelmingly common, especially for outer tunics worn by the majority. Sheep were relatively plentiful, and wool possessed valuable properties. It offered significant warmth even when damp. It was remarkably durable under harsh use, and it had some natural resistance to water and dirt. However, this wasn't the soft, refined wool we might handle today. Medieval wool was often coarse, thick, sometimes oily, and could be decidedly itchy when worn directly against the skin for long periods. Linen, derived from the fibers of the flax plant through a laborious process, was another key textile. Being smoother and more breathable than wool, it was preferred for garments worn closer to the body, if affordable. A linen shift or tunic felt considerably less abrasive than a woolen one. However, linen provided less insulation, was generally less durable than coarse wool, and represented a greater investment in either time, if processed at home, or money, if purchased. The choice between wool and linen often came down to practicality, climate, and economic means. Thinking about the typical outfit, simplicity was key. Unlike the elaborate, multi-layered costumes often associated with medieval nobility or merchants seen in illustrations, the peasant's daily attire was far less complex. An outer tunic, perhaps made of wool, possibly worn over a simpler linen undertunic or shift, if fortunate, might constitute the main body covering. This would often be belted at the waist, usually with a simple cord or a strip of leather, allowing tools or a pouch to be attached. Added layers were minimal, perhaps a rough woolen cloak or mantle thrown over the shoulders in cold or wet weather. And what lay beneath this main tunic? The concept of underwear, as we know it today, with specialized close-fitting garments designed for hygiene and comfort, was not widespread. Men might wear simple brays or breeches, essentially loose-fitting shorts or trousers made of linen, often tied at the waist and sometimes extending partway down the leg. Women, if they wore an underlayer, would typically have a basic linen shift or chemise, similar in cut to the tunic but worn directly against the skin. For many of the poorest, however, this underlayer might be absent altogether, meaning the coarse wool tunic was their only garment. Given this limited ownership, perhaps only one or two tunics to one's name, you might expect frequent washing to keep them serviceable. Yet the reality was quite the opposite. Laundering clothes in the medieval period was an incredibly arduous and time-consuming task, undertaken far less frequently than we might imagine, perhaps only a few times per year for outer garments. There were no convenient taps delivering clean water into the home, no washing machines to automate the labor, and no gentle, specialized detergents to protect the fabric. The process of washing usually involved hauling heavy buckets of water from a well, or more commonly, taking the soiled garments down to a nearby stream or river. Here, they would be beaten against smooth stones, trampled underfoot in the water, or vigorously scrubbed, possibly using abrasive materials like sand or rough brushes to dislodge the ingrained dirt. Soap, when used, was often a harsh concoction made from rendered animal fat, boiled with lye, wood ash, alkali, which cleaned effectively but could also weaken fabric fibers over repeated uses. The consequences of such infrequent and harsh cleaning were manifold and directly impacted the wearer's daily experience. Clothes inevitably accumulated layers of grime and dirt from the fields, grease from cooking, sweat from labor, soot and smoke from open hearths. This ingrained dirt would make the fabric stiff and even heavier, and inevitably the clothes would carry a strong odor. The combined sense of human sweat, smoke, proximity to animals, cooking smells, and the general environment would permeate the wool or linen fibers, becoming a constant olfactory backdrop to life. Imagine wearing the same rough garment day after day, engaging in manual labor, tending livestock, cooking over smoky fires, sleeping near the hearth or alongside animals brought inside for warmth. Stains from mud, food spills, plant matter, perhaps even droplets of blood from minor cuts or scratches would become indelible parts of the fabric's story. The clothing acted almost like a sponge, absorbing the wearer's life and environment. Garments were worn until they were threadbare, patched repeatedly with scraps of other old cloth, telling a silent story of poverty and persistence. Footwear, much like clothing, prioritized function over comfort or style. For those who could afford shoes, the most common type was the turn shoe. This was constructed from pieces of leather, often untanned or minimally treated hide, stitched together while damp and inside out when finished. This method produced a simple, flexible shoe. However, the leather readily absorbed water, offered little support, and tended to wear out quickly under constant use on rough terrain. Durability was a constant concern. Consequently, many people, particularly children and adults during warmer weather or while working in muddy fields, simply went without shoes. Going barefoot was a common sight and a practical adaptation to the limitations and cost of footwear. Feet would become tough and calloused over time, providing some natural protection. However, this also left them vulnerable to cuts, infections from soil-borne bacteria like tetanus, thorns, splinters, and the bites of insects or other small creatures. Each option, shoes or no shoes, came with its own set of discomforts and risks. Now try to synthesize the sensory experience of being dressed in these clothes. Feel the constant low-level friction of coarse wool fibers rubbing against the skin, or the slightly less irritating but still rough texture of basic linen. Factor in the stiffness of the fabric, made heavier and less pliable by accumulated dirt and sweat. Consider the dampness that could cling for hours after being caught in the rain or from simple perspiration during hard work. Add the potential presence of unwelcome companions like lice or fleas, finding refuge in the seams and folds of the garments. This combination often resulted in persistent, nagging discomfort. Itching was likely a frequent sensation. Chafing, particularly where the rough fabric rubbed at the neck, underarms, or waist, if belted, could lead to sores. There was a general lack of softness, of ease, of the feeling of being clean and comfortable in one's own clothes that we often take for granted. It was clothing as basic as shelter, often falling short of providing genuine physical comfort throughout the long medieval day. In conclusion, the wardrobe of the typical medieval peasant was a stark illustration of life reduced to essentials. One or two simple, functional outfits, usually made of itchy wool or rough linen, served all purposes. These garments were infrequently washed due to the sheer difficulty of the task, leading them to become stiff, smelly, and ingrained with the physical evidence of hard labor and a close connection to the environment. From the all-purpose tunic to the basic turnshoe or the common practice of going barefoot, clothing was a constant, tangible reminder of the limited resources, lack of sanitation, and the often uncomfortable reality of everyday survival centuries ago. Beyond the fundamental struggles for adequate food, reliable shelter, and functional clothing, the experience of everyday life in medieval times encompassed a layer of more intimate, often unavoidable physical challenges. These weren't mere inconveniences that could be easily remedied. They were persistent bodily troubles, constant companions that affected people across the entire social spectrum. Let's gently explore some of these pervasive afflictions now, beginning with the tiny creatures that made their homes on and around the human body. Imagine existing in a world largely devoid of the tools we use to control pests. No readily available chemical insecticides, no regular access to hot baths or showers, no efficient washing machines employing high temperatures and potent detergents. In this environment, minuscule parasites found ample opportunity to thrive. Fleas were abundant, easily transferring from domestic animals, livestock, or the straw used in bedding and flooring onto their human hosts. Lice, too, were commonplace, head lice finding refuge in hair, and body lice favoring the seams and folds of clothing. Adding to this unwelcome menagerie were bedbugs, masters of concealment lurking in the crevices of wooden bed frames, straw-filled mattresses or cracks in walls, emerging under the cover of darkness to feed on sleeping humans. These various creatures weren't exceptional occurrences. They were, for most people throughout the medieval period, simply an accepted, albeit unpleasant fact of daily life. Eradicating them completely was an almost insurmountable challenge with the knowledge and resources available at the time. It's easy to assume such infestations were solely the burden of the poor, living in conditions we might perceive as less sanitary. However, these parasites demonstrated a remarkable lack of concern for social standing. Fleas and lice could trouble inhabitants of drafty castles just as easily as those in humble peasant cottages. They could be found in straw bedding and in the more luxurious feather beds of the wealthy. If even nobility who might own more changes of clothing found laundering elaborate garments difficult, and full-body bathing remained an infrequent activity for most, parasites were truly ubiquitous. The most immediate and universally understood consequence of sharing one's life with these tiny companions was the relentless, maddening itch. Picture the constant, nagging sensation, the involuntary urge to scratch that could disrupt concentration during the day and ruin sleep at night. Skin inevitably became irritated, inflamed, and often broken from persistent scratching with dirty fingernails. These small wounds could then easily become infected, leading to painful sores, boils, or more widespread skin infections, adding another layer of misery to the original infestation. And the discomfort wasn't limited to bites alone. Other microscopic troublemakers contributed to skin woes. Scabies, an intensely itchy condition caused by mites burrowing beneath the skin's surface, was also prevalent. This often manifested as rashes and sores, particularly on the hands, wrists, and between the fingers, areas where the mites tended to congregate. Various common fungal infections, such as ringworm, also flourished in environments where maintaining personal dryness and cleanliness was a constant struggle. Skin afflictions were simply a visible, tangible part of medieval reality. Moving from the surface of the skin inwards, the mouth presented another significant arena for common, often painful, medieval body troubles. Oral hygiene, as we practice it today with specialized tools and products, was entirely non-existent. The fundamental knowledge about bacterial plaque, fluorides, protective properties, and the importance of daily cleaning routines lay far in the future. This left medieval teeth and gums highly vulnerable to decay, infection, and the resulting agony that could overshadow all other aspects of life. Consider the absence of basic tools, no toothbrushes with precisely designed bristles, no commercially produced toothpastes formulated with fluoride and gentle abrasives, no dental floss to clean the tight spaces between teeth where food particles and bacteria accumulate. While it's true that the typical medieval diet contained significantly less refined sugar than modern diets, which did offer some degree of protection against rapid decay, other dietary factors like coarse, abrasive breads and acidic beverages like ale could still take their toll on tooth enamel over time. People were not entirely oblivious to dental appearance or the unpleasantness of bad breath. Some rudimentary cleaning methods were likely employed. Chewing on certain types of twigs, such as those from the hazel or birch tree, could provide a degree of mechanical cleaning through friction and stimulate salival flow. Rubbing the teeth with a piece of rough linen cloth, perhaps dipped in water, salt, or powdered herbs like sage, might also have been practiced by some individuals seeking a cleaner feeling or fresher breath. However, these methods were inconsistent and largely ineffective at removing harmful plaque buildup. The almost inevitable consequence of this lack of effective hygiene was widespread dental disease. Tooth decay, or cavities, became increasingly common as people aged. Teeth could crack under the strain of chewing hard foods or suffer from excessive wear. Bacterial infection could penetrate deep into the tooth's pulp, leading to excruciatingly painful abscesses, pockets of pus forming at the tooth's root or within the surrounding gum tissue. Chronic bad breath, known medically as halitosis, would have been an extremely common and socially challenging affliction. The pain of a severe toothache is difficult to overstate. Imagine a deep, throbbing, relentless agony radiating through the jaw, making eating, sleeping, or even thinking clearly almost impossible. Now place this experience in an era lacking effective analgesics, painkillers, anti-phlegmic drugs, or antibiotics to combat underlying infection. Such pain wasn't just a temporary nuisance. It could persist for weeks or months, completely dominating a person's life, hindering their ability to work and function with no easy or reliable prospect of relief in sight. When tooth pain became unbearable, the available options for treatment were stark and often terrifying. There were no specialized dentists employing delicate instruments and anesthesia. Instead, the desperate sufferer would typically seek out a local barber surgeon. These jacks of all trades were responsible for cutting hair and shaving beards, but also for performing minor surgical procedures like bloodletting, lancing boils, setting broken bones, and, significantly, extracting diseased teeth. They possessed the necessary tools and the perceived authority to undertake this daunting task. The process of tooth extraction was notoriously brutal. Without effective anesthesia, perhaps only a stiff drink of alcohol or some herbal concoction offering minimal numbing effect, the patient had to endure the ordeal fully conscious and likely restrained. The barber surgeon would employ robust metal instruments, such as fearsome-looking pliers or forceps, or a lever-like tool known aptly as a pelican, to grasp the afflicted tooth firmly. Then, using a combination of rocking, twisting, and sheer physical force, they would attempt to wrench the tooth from its socket in the jawbone. This procedure was inherently dangerous and carried significant risks. The immense force required could, and sometimes did, fracture the patient's jaw. If the tooth broke during extraction, infected root fragments might be left behind, leading to chronic infection. The instruments themselves were unlikely to be sterilized, creating a high risk of introducing dangerous bacteria deep into the wound. Infection of the tooth socket or the surrounding bone, a condition called osteomyelitis, was a serious possibility. In the worst outcomes, this infection could spread into the bloodstream, causing sepsis, a systemic, often fatal condition. Therefore, alongside the daily efforts to secure food and shelter, the medieval individual often contended with a body under siege. From the constant low-level irritation of skin parasites like fleas, lice, and mites, to the potential agony of decaying teeth and the terrifying prospect of crude extraction, these physical troubles were woven into the very fabric of existence. They stand as a poignant reminder of the vulnerabilities faced in an age before modern hygiene practices, dentistry, and effective medical interventions became commonplace, profoundly shaping the experience of simply being alive. In the sprawling tapestry of medieval European society, one thread dominated the pattern above all others: agricultural labor. While a small percentage consisted of nobility living in castles, clergy within monasteries, or artisans in growing towns, the overwhelming majority, likely around 90% of the population, were peasants. Their lives were fundamentally intertwined with the soil, their existence measured not by clocks or formal calendars, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the slow turn of the seasons, and the relentless demands of cultivating the land that fed everyone. The rhythm of the peasant's workday was dictated entirely by natural light, Labor typically commenced as soon as the dawn sky provided enough illumination to see and continued until dusk rendered further outdoor work impractical or impossible. There were no strictly defined 8-hour shifts or factory whistles signaling breaks. The long days of summer meant extended hours of toil, while the shorter days of winter offered less light but often no less demanding tasks, such as threshing grain indoors or mending tools. Time was marked by the sun's arc, the progress of work, and perhaps the distant chime of church bells. This demanding daily schedule generally spanned 6 days of the week. Sunday held a special significance, primarily dedicated to religious observance and attending Mass. It was, in theory, a day of rest from regular field labor, a divine commandment. However, certain essential chores like feeding and watering livestock, milking cows, or essential repairs could not be entirely neglected. Furthermore, during critical agricultural periods like planting or harvest, if weather threatened the precious crops, even the sanctity of Sunday might yield to the urgent need to secure the yield. The specific tasks filling these long days followed the unwavering cycle of the agricultural year. Spring was the time for plowing, the arduous process of breaking open the heavy, often compacted soil to prepare it for planting. This frequently involved guiding a simple wooden plow, maybe reinforced with an iron tip, pulled by a pair of slow, steady oxen if the peasant family was fortunate enough to own or have access to them. On smaller plots or for poorer families, this backbreaking work might even rely partially on human muscle power. After plowing came sowing, scattering seeds carefully by hand from a bag or apron. As the crops began to sprout and grow, a new battle commenced against weeds. These unwelcome competitors vied for sunlight, water, and nutrients in the soil, threatening the potential harvest. Weeding was often painstaking manual labor, requiring hours spent stooping, kneeling, or bending over, meticulously pulling weeds by hand or using basic tools like a simple hoe. Then, as summer waned, came the harvest, the most critical and intensive period. Armed with a curved sickle for reaping handfuls of grain or a long-handled scythe for wider swaths, peasants worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk to cut the ripened crops. Even after the crops were cut and gathered, the work was far from over. The harvested grain needed to be separated from the inedible stalks and chaff. This process, known as threshing, often involved using a tool called a flail, essentially a long wooden handle connected by a leather thong or simple joint to a shorter, heavier wooden bar, the swipple. Inside a barn or on a hard-packed threshing floor, sheaves of grain were beaten rhythmically with the flail. This was dusty, strenuous work, typically carried out during the autumn and winter months, ensuring every precious grain was secured. The tools available to accomplish these monumental tasks were remarkably basic, relying almost entirely on human or animal power. Besides the simple plow, sickle, scythe, and flail, a peasant's toolkit might include wooden spades, sometimes reinforced with an iron edge for durability, rudimentary hoes and rakes often made entirely of wood, and pitchforks for moving hay or sheaves. There were no tractors, combine harvesters, or automated machines. Efficiency depended on learned skill, accumulated experience, physical endurance, and sheer, unyielding perseverance. This was labor in its most raw and physically demanding form. It involved a constant, strenuous interaction with the earth and its produce. Imagine the strain of lifting heavy sacks of grain, the effort of keeping a plow steady in rocky soil, the repetitive, full-body motion of swinging a scythe hour after hour, the endless bending and stooping required for weeding or planting. It demanded considerable stamina and raw physical strength, qualities developed through a lifetime of such toil, often starting in childhood. There was precious little respite from these physical demands. Crucially, this world offered no safety net for those whose bodies failed them. Concepts like paid sick leave, disability allowances, or unemployment benefits were completely alien. If a peasant became too ill to work or suffered a debilitating injury, their ability to feed themselves and their family vanished almost instantly. Survival might depend on the charity of neighbors, the assistance of the local church, or perhaps the leniency of their lord. But support was never guaranteed. The pressure to keep working, even through pain or illness, was immense. Stopping could mean destitution. Peasant women were integral to this workforce, their contributions essential for the household survival. They routinely worked alongside men in the fields, particularly during the demanding periods of planting, weeding, and especially the harvest. However, their labor extended far beyond the fields. The women typically bore the primary responsibility for a vast range of domestic tasks, tending the small vegetable garden near the cottage, caring for young children, preparing meals, which often involved laborious tasks like grinding grain by hand into flour and baking bread, fetching water daily from a well or stream, spinning wool or flax fibers into thread for cloth, weaving fabric, mending worn clothing, and looking after poultry or other small livestock. Their work truly never ended. What provided the motivation to endure such a difficult and often thankless existence? For the vast majority, the driving force was brutally straightforward: survival. Labor directly translated into the food needed to sustain the family and the resources required to pay the rents, tithes, or dues owed to the lord of the manor or the church. Failure to meet these obligations could result in hunger, eviction, and utter ruin. This wasn't work driven by ambition or the prospect of upward mobility. It was work undertaken out of fundamental necessity, a relentless cycle tied to the earth. The cumulative effect of years spent performing such arduous physical labor inevitably took a profound toll on the human body. Chronic ailments like persistent back pain, degenerative joint disease, arthritis, hernias resulting from heavy lifting, and injuries sustained from accidents involving tools or animals were exceedingly common. Poor nutrition often weakened bodies further, making them more susceptible to illness and slowing recovery. Consequently, life expectancy was significantly lower than in modern times, and the physical signs of aging appeared much earlier, etched into the stooped postures and weathered bodies of the medieval peasantry. In essence, the life of a typical medieval peasant was overwhelmingly defined by the grind, an unceasing round of demanding physical tasks governed by daylight and the rhythm of the seasons. From sunrise to sunset, often 6 days a week, they toiled with rudimentary tools and their own muscle power to cultivate the land that formed the base of the entire medieval economy. It was a life offering minimal rest, scant opportunity for recovery, and ruled by the fundamental imperative to survive, leaving an enduring legacy of physical hardship on the vast majority who lived through this era. We've touched upon the rhythms of work, the simplicity of clothing, the basics of diet, and the troubles of the body in medieval times, yet woven through all these facets of daily existence was an unceasing dialogue with the natural world, particularly the weather. In an era profoundly lacking our modern conveniences of climate control, no central heating, no air conditioning, no effective insulation, the challenge of merely sheltering from the elements was immense and constant. Nature wasn't a distant phenomenon viewed through a window. It was an immediate, powerful, and often intrusive force shaping life moment by moment. The typical dwelling of a medieval peasant offered only the most rudimentary shield against this force. Walls were commonly fashioned using the wattle and daub technique. A woven lattice of flexible branches, or wooden strips, the wattle, was plastered over with a sticky mixture of clay, mud, straw, dung, and sand, the daub. While providing a basic structure, this method was susceptible to the weather. Over time, drying and settling could cause cracks to appear, creating numerous small openings through which cold winds could whistle and dampness could penetrate, especially during driving rain. Roofs provided overhead cover, most often thatched with bundles of straw, reeds, or heather tightly layered to shed water. A well-maintained thatch could be reasonably effective, but it required periodic repair and replacement. Over time, thatch could rot, develop leaks, or become infested with insects, rodents, or birds. Furthermore, it offered minimal insulation against temperature extremes. The roof structure itself might be simple timbers, rough-hewn and basic, supporting the weight of the thatch but offering little additional barrier against the outside world. Inside, the floor was seldom more than packed earth, perhaps mixed with sand or gravel. This surface was in direct contact with the ground beneath, meaning it was perpetually cool to the touch and prone to absorbing moisture, especially during wet seasons or if drainage around the dwelling was poor. This damp, cold floor radiated chill upwards, contributing significantly to the overall coldness of the interior space, particularly noticeable when lying down to sleep on a simple straw pallet placed directly upon it. Keeping the floor dry and warm was an ongoing, often losing battle. Openings for light and air were kept small and few to minimize heat loss and maintain security. Glass windows were an almost unimaginable luxury, confined mostly to churches or the grandest castles. Instead, window openings in peasant homes might be covered by simple wooden shutters that could be closed against bad weather but plunged the interior into near darkness. Alternatively, stretched animal hides like parchment, scraped thin, or pieces of cloth soaked in oil or resin might be used. These allowed some dim, translucent light to filter through but offered negligible insulation. The heart of the home, both literally and figuratively, was the hearth. Often situated in the center of the main room or against a stone or clay-lined wall, the fire provided essential warmth for survival and the means for cooking food. However, medieval hearths in simple dwellings were often inefficient, lacking well-designed chimneys until later in the period for common houses. Much of the smoke from the burning wood or peat simply curled upwards into the living space. It filled the air with acrid fumes before eventually finding its way out through gaps in the roof or eaves, or a dedicated smoke hole. When winter descended, these basic shelters became cold traps rather than cozy refuges. The numerous small cracks and gaps in the walls and roof allowed frigid air to infiltrate relentlessly. The packed earth floor felt like ice underfoot. Without any form of insulation in the walls or roof space, the minimal warmth generated by the central hearth radiated outwards quickly, leaving areas away from the fire almost as cold as the outdoors. Fans would have spent much of their indoor time huddled closely around the flames, wrapped in whatever cloaks or blankets they possessed. Adding to the misery of the cold was the persistent dampness. Moisture seeped up from the ground, permeated the porous walls, and dripped slowly from any leaks in the aging thatch. In the damp, cool air, clothes, bedding, and even stored goods felt perpetually clammy. Drying washclothes near the smoky fire was a slow, often frustrating process. The combination of cold and damp was particularly hard on extremities. Painful, itchy chilblains on fingers and toes were likely a very common winter ailment, a constant reminder of the body's struggle against the environment. Maintaining the vital hearth fire required a continuous supply of fuel, which usually meant firewood or, in some regions, peat. Acquiring this fuel was not always straightforward. Peasants living on manorial estates often had restricted rights regarding the collection of wood from the lord's forests. They might be permitted to gather only dead wood that had fallen naturally or could be reached by hook or by crook, using a simple hooked pole. Cutting down standing trees typically required special permission and might involve payment or additional labor service. Gathering, chopping, and hauling fuel was hard, physical work, consuming valuable time and energy, especially during the short, cold days of winter when it was needed most. While winter presented the stark challenge of cold, summer brought its own array of discomforts within these rudimentary homes. With limited ventilation and roofs that readily absorbed the heat of the sun, the interiors could become intensely hot, stuffy, and humid during warm weather. There existed no mechanisms for cooling, no electric fans, no cross breezes easily created through large windows, no air conditioning. The trapped heat made indoor activities, particularly cooking over the already hot hearth, almost unbearable at times, offering little relief from the outdoor summer temperatures. The warmth and relative stillness of summer air also created ideal conditions for insects and amplified unpleasant smells. Flies, inevitably attracted to nearby dung heaps, food scraps, or inadequate sanitation, would buzz incessantly indoors, settling on everything and potentially carrying disease. Stagnant water sources near dwellings, such as puddles or ditches, served as breeding grounds for mosquitoes, whose bites added another layer of irritation, particularly at night. Furthermore, the heat tended to intensify the ambient odors of unwashed bodies, stale smoke, nearby animals, and accumulated waste, making the close atmosphere heavy and disagreeable. But this intimate and often challenging relationship with the weather extended far beyond the realm of personal comfort. It was fundamentally tied to survival itself. The success or failure of the agricultural cycle, the very basis of medieval life, depended critically on favorable weather conditions. Sufficient rain at the right times, adequate sunshine for growth, and the absence of devastating events like late frosts, hailstorms, or prolonged droughts were essential for a good harvest. Consecutive seasons of bad weather could and frequently did lead to widespread crop failure, scarcity, famine, and desperation. Weather extremes also exerted a direct influence on health and mortality. The persistent cold and damp of winter undoubtedly contributed to a high incidence of respiratory ailments, from common coughs and colds to more serious conditions like bronchitis and pneumonia, which were often fatal in an age without antibiotics. During summer heat waves, strenuous physical labor in the fields carried the risk of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Flooding events could contaminate drinking water sources, leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery or cholera. The weather was an active agent in sickness and health. Living through the medieval period thus meant accepting a profound and constant vulnerability to the natural elements. The simple dwellings constructed by the majority offered only a fragile, permeable barrier against the powerful forces of heat, cold, wind, and precipitation. Daily existence was lived in close, unavoidable contact with the natural world, its beauty and its harshness. There was no thermostat to adjust, no reliable forecast to consult, no insulated refuge to retreat into. Life unfolded largely at the mercy of nature's unpredictable moods and rhythms. In conclusion, the struggle against nature's whims, mediated through the imperfections of basic shelter, was a defining characteristic of everyday medieval life. The biting chill and pervasive dampness of winter, the stifling heat and bothersome pests of summer, and the critical reliance on cooperative weather for the harvest that meant life or death. All these factors profoundly shaped the human experience. It highlights a world fundamentally different from our own, one defined by a constant, palpable awareness of the elements and humanity's limited power to control or escape them. In the often harsh landscape of medieval existence, where daily life presented numerous challenges to survival, the specter of illness and injury cast a particularly long shadow. Falling sick was more than just an inconvenience. It represented a profound threat to one's livelihood and very life, especially for those reliant on physical labor. Yet, the way sickness was perceived, understood, and confronted was vastly different from our modern medical perspective. Medieval medicine operated within a unique framework, blending ancient theories, practical experience, and deeply held beliefs, often with results that seem strange or even harmful to us today. The cornerstone of formal medical thought throughout the Middle Ages, a legacy inherited directly from influential ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates, and later expanded by Roman thinkers like Galen, was the theory of the four humors. This enduring doctrine proposed that the human body was composed of and governed by four fundamental fluids or humors: blood, associated with the element of air and qualities of warmth and moisture; phlegm, linked to water, cold, and moisture; yellow bile, or choler, connected to fire, warmth, and dryness; and black bile, or melancholy, tied to earth, cold, and dryness. According to this theory, perfect health was the result of these four humors existing in harmonious balance within the individual, each present in its correct proportion and quality. Conversely, illness was believed to arise whenever this delicate equilibrium was disturbed. An excess or deficiency of one or more humors, or a corruption, poor quality of a humor, was thought to manifest as specific symptoms and diseases. A person with a fever and flushed skin might be diagnosed with an excess of blood, while someone pale and lethargic might be seen as having too much phlegm or black bile. Given this understanding of illness as an internal imbalance, the primary objective of most medical treatments was to restore the body's natural humoral equilibrium. If a particular humor was deemed to be present in excess, the logical course of action was often to remove that excess from the body. If a humor was deficient, treatments might involve prescribing foods or herbs thought to generate more of that humor. Much of medieval therapeutic strategy therefore revolved around correcting these perceived imbalances, often through methods designed to expel unwanted substances. Perhaps the most iconic and widely practiced of these treatments was bloodletting, also known as phlebotomy, based on the idea that many ailments stemmed from an overabundance of blood, a condition termed plethora. Practitioners believed that removing a controlled amount of this vital fluid could alleviate symptoms and restore balance. This was commonly achieved by making a small incision in a vein, usually in the crook of the elbow, using a specialized sharp knife called a lancet, or a tool known as a phleem, allowing blood to flow into a measuring bowl. Alternatively, bloodletting was frequently performed using medicinal leeches, Hirudo medicinalis. These segmented worms, carefully applied to the patient's skin over a targeted area, would attach themselves with suckers and make a small, Y-shaped incision with their tiny teeth. As they drew blood, they released saliva containing hirudin, a powerful anticoagulant preventing clotting, along with anesthetic compounds that numbed the bite area. Leeches were used for centuries to treat a vast array of conditions believed to be caused by excess blood or localized bad humors. Purging the body through other routes was another cornerstone of humoral therapy. If an excess of yellow bile associated with anger and digestive upset was suspected, physicians might prescribe emetics, substances derived from plants like hellebore, designed to induce forceful vomiting and thus expel the offending humor from the stomach. Similarly, strong laxatives and purgatives, made from various herbs such as senna or rhubarb or even mineral compounds, were administered to cleanse the bowels of perceived imbalances or corrupt humors, particularly black bile linked to melancholy. Enemas were also used for this purpose. Beyond these often harsh subtractive therapies, medieval medicine employed other approaches. Herbalism played a crucial role, with a vast pharmacopoeia of plants believed to possess specific qualities, hot, cold, wet, dry, capable of counteracting humoral imbalances. Diet was also considered vital. Patients were often advised to consume or avoid certain foods based on their perceived humoral properties. And interwoven with all medical practices was the profound influence of religious faith. Prayer, confession, charitable acts, and pilgrimages to the shrines of saints were considered essential components of seeking healing. The providers of medical care formed a varied hierarchy. At the apex were the university-educated physicians, almost exclusively men who had studied the classical texts of Galen and Avicenna. They specialized in complex diagnoses based on humoral theory, often involving detailed examination of urine, uroscopy, pulse taking, and consideration of astrological influences. However, these learned physicians were scarce, mostly found in larger cities, and their fees placed them far beyond the reach of ordinary people. They rarely performed manual procedures themselves. For more hands-on interventions, the essential tasks of bloodletting, treating wounds, setting broken bones, lancing abscesses, or pulling teeth, the populace generally relied on barber surgeons. These practitioners learned their craft through apprenticeship rather than formal academic study. They possessed the necessary tools, razors, lancets, forceps, saws, and the practical skills for procedures deemed beneath the dignity of physician. Their shops, often marked by the iconic red and white striped poles symbolizing blood and bandages, were familiar fixtures in medieval towns. Especially in rural areas, much everyday health care fell to local healers, often women, wise women who possessed deep knowledge of traditional remedies and herbal medicine passed down through generations. They served as community herbalists, midwives attending births, and caregivers for common ailments, offering accessible and, albeit unregulated, health care based on practical experience and folk wisdom. Apothecaries also played a role, compounding and dispensing remedies prescribed by physicians or based on their own knowledge. Crucially absent from this entire system was any comprehension of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, as agents of disease. The germ theory lay centuries in the future. Illness was explained solely through the lenses of humoral imbalance, environmental factors like miasma, foul air thought to rise from swamps or decaying matter, astrological alignments, or as a consequence of sin or divine will. This fundamental lack of understanding about infection profoundly limited the effectiveness of treatments and prevented basic hygiene measures. Consequences of this ignorance were severe. Without an understanding of germs, the importance of cleanliness and sterilization in medical procedures was completely unrecognized. Instruments were rarely washed adequately between patients. A barber surgeon might use the same unclean tools to lance an abscess, pull a tooth, and then perhaps shave another customer. Wounds were dressed with unsterilized cloth. As a result, medical interventions themselves frequently became sources of dangerous infection, turning treatable conditions into fatal ones. Compounding the danger was the near-total lack of effective anesthesia. While rudimentary substances like alcohol, opium extracts, or preparations from plants like mandrake or henbane might have been used in attempts to dull pain or induce stupor, their effects were unreliable, difficult to control dosage, and often insufficient for major procedures. Patients typically had to endure the agony of surgery, amputations, removal of bladder stones, cauterization of wounds with hot irons. Fully conscious, perhaps physically restrained by strong assistance, the fear of the procedure must have been immense. In this precarious medical landscape, even seemingly minor health problems could escalate rapidly into life-threatening crises. A simple cut from a farming tool could become infected, leading to gangrene and the need for amputation, or to deadly sepsis, blood poisoning. A fractured limb, especially if the skin was broken, an open fracture, could easily lead to fatal infection of the bone or surrounding tissues. Common bacterial infections that are easily managed with antibiotics today could readily overwhelm the body's defenses. There were simply no targeted weapons against microbial invaders. In summary, medieval medicine operated within a framework vastly different from our own, guided by the ancient theory of the four humors and hampered by a complete lack of understanding regarding germs and infection. Treatments like bloodletting and purging, while intended to restore balance, often weaken patients further. Procedures were performed without effective pain relief and under unsterile conditions, making even minor interventions risky. While practitioners acted with the best intentions based on the knowledge of their time, both illness and the attempts to cure it were fraught with peril, highlighting the profound impact of scientific understanding on health and survival. In the landscape of medieval Europe, one institution stood above all others in its pervasive influence and unquestioned authority: the Church. Specifically in Western Europe, this meant the Roman Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome under the leadership of the Pope. It was far more than just a spiritual entity. It was the bedrock of society, deeply embedded in the fabric of law, politics, culture, art, education, and the very conception of time and the cosmos. For the average person, the Church's presence was an inescapable reality, shaping their life from the moment of baptism soon after birth until the administration of last rites at the hour of death. The Church's influence extended to the fundamental rhythm of life itself. The yearly calendar was structured around a cycle of Christian feasts, fasts, and commemorations of saints, dictating periods of celebration and penitence and often providing the only sanctioned holidays or breaks from relentless labor. Even the passage of each day was marked by the church. The ringing of bells from the local church or monastery signaled the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sex, none, vespers, and compline, calling the clergy and monks to prayer, and simultaneously serving as the primary timekeeping device for the entire community. Attending Mass on Sundays and major feast days was not merely encouraged, it was generally considered a solemn obligation for all baptized Christians. Willful absence without a justifiable reason was deemed a sin, requiring confession and penance. The parish church building itself often dominated the local landscape, typically being the largest, most permanent, and most ornate structure in a village or town. It functioned as the spiritual heart of the community, but also as a social hub, where news might be exchanged, important announcements made, and collective identity reinforced. Its consecrated ground held the community's dead. Central to the church's teachings, and deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset, was the concept of sin. Based on the biblical narrative, all humanity was believed to inherit the original sin stemming from Adam and Eve's disobedience. Beyond this inherited flaw, individuals accumulated personal sins through thoughts, words, deeds, or omissions that violated God's laws or the specific precepts of the church. Life was often framed as a constant moral struggle against temptation, with the eternal fate of one's soul hanging precariously in the balance, demanding vigilance and repentance. The alternative to salvation was terrifyingly vivid in the medieval imagination. Hell was not presented as a vague concept but as a graphically real place of endless suffering, reserved for those who died in a state of unrepented mortal sin. Sermons, dramatic plays, manuscript illuminations, sculptures, and wall paintings spared no detail in depicting its horrors. Vast caverns filled with unquenchable fire, grotesque demons inflicting unimaginable tortures upon damned souls, abysses of ice, monstrous serpents, and torments tailored to the specific sins committed during life. This visceral fear of eternal damnation was a powerful tool for encouraging conformity and piety. While the fear of hell was potent, the church also offered hope and pathways to salvation. The ultimate goal was heaven, depicted as eternal bliss in the presence of God. For souls not pure enough for immediate entry into heaven but not damned to hell, the doctrine of purgatory offered an intermediate state of temporary suffering and purification. Prayers and masses offered by the living were believed to help shorten the time souls spent in purgatory. Accessing God's grace, necessary for salvation, was primarily achieved through the church's sacraments: baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, Mass, penance, confession, last rites, holy orders, and matrimony. Devotion to the Virgin Mary and the saints, seen as powerful intercessors, was also crucial. Despite the Bible being revered as the foundational text of Christianity, its contents remained largely inaccessible to the vast majority of medieval people. Throughout much of the period, scriptures were copied and circulated almost exclusively in Latin. This was the language of the church hierarchy, liturgy, and scholarship, but it was not the common vernacular language spoken by ordinary people across Europe. Compounding this barrier was widespread illiteracy. Most peasants, laborers, and even many minor nobles could not read any language, let alone decipher complex theological texts in Latin. Consequently, religious understanding and belief were transmitted primarily through other channels. The weekly sermon delivered by the parish priest during Mass was a vital source of instruction, explaining biblical stories, clarifying doctrine, and outlining moral expectations. Given the low literacy rates, visual communication was extremely important. Stained glass windows, intricate sculptures adorning church portals and interiors, vivid wall paintings, and carved altarpieces served as powerful books for the illiterate, illustrating key biblical narratives, lives of saints, and theological concepts like the Last Judgment in memorable detail. The church's immense spiritual authority was underpinned by substantial economic power. A cornerstone of its wealth was the tithe, a compulsory contribution expected from all Christians. Theoretically representing 1/10 of a person's income or agricultural produce, tithes were collected locally to support the parish priest, maintain the church building, and contribute to the wider church hierarchy. Peasants were typically required to set aside 1/10 of their harvested grain, newborn livestock, wool, or other products. Non-payment could lead to serious spiritual sanctions, including denial of communion or burial in consecrated ground. Beyond the tithe, the church amassed wealth through various other means. As an institution, it became one of the largest landowners in Europe over the centuries. Monasteries, cathedrals, and bishoprics controlled vast tracts of land, earning substantial revenues from tenant farmers' rents and the direct exploitation of agricultural resources. Fees were also commonly charged for performing essential sacraments and services like baptisms, marriages, and funerals. In the later Middle Ages, the practice of selling indulgences, documents offering remission of the temporal punishment due for confessed sins, became a controversial but significant source of income for the papacy. The Church rigorously defended its doctrines and authority against any challenge. Disagreement with established dogma or questioning the Church's authority was labeled heresy, considered not just an error in belief, but a dangerous crime against God and the Christian community. Heresy was seen as a contagion that could corrupt souls and destabilize society, and it was pursued vigorously. Church courts, and later formal bodies like the Papal Inquisition, were established to investigate suspected heretics, interrogate them, and compel them to renounce their perceived errors. The methods used to maintain doctrinal control and ensure conformity were powerful. Excommunication, the formal act of cutting someone off from the sacraments and the community of the faithful, was a terrifying prospect for medieval believers, believed to imperil their eternal salvation and rendering them social pariahs. Individuals judged to be obstinate or unrepentant heretics were often handed over to the secular authorities for punishment, which, depending on the time and place, could range from imprisonment and confiscation of property to execution, most infamously by being burned at the stake. Therefore, the role and impact of the Church in medieval life were profoundly complex. It undeniably offered spiritual comfort, a framework for understanding the world, moral guidance, community cohesion through shared rituals, and the ultimate hope of salvation in what was often a difficult and uncertain existence. It provided structure, meaning, and beauty through its art and liturgy. Yet simultaneously, it wielded enormous temporal and spiritual power, fostered deep anxieties about sin and damnation, imposed significant financial burdens, and exercised strict control over belief and expression, often relying on fear and coercion to maintain its authority. In conclusion, the presence of the Church permeated every aspect of medieval society, shaping the worldview, daily routines, and ultimate aspirations of people from all walks of life. Its bells told the hours, its feasts marked the year, its teachings defined right and wrong, and its authority extended from the peasant's hut to the king's court. Whether experienced primarily as a source of solace and divine grace, or as an omnipresent force demanding obedience and resources, or more likely as a complex mixture of both, the grip of faith and fear was an inescapable and defining feature of everyday life in the Middle Ages. While we've explored the general tapestry of everyday medieval life, with its shared hardships and common struggles, it's important to recognize that navigating this world often presented a distinct set of challenges for women. Their experiences were profoundly shaped by biological realities, deeply entrenched social structures, and prevailing cultural attitudes that frequently placed them in positions of subservience and vulnerability. For medieval women, survival often meant enduring life under a unique combination of constraints, demanding resilience and fortitude in the face of limited choices and significant risks. For the vast majority of women, regardless of their social standing, the path through life led inexorably towards marriage. Betrothals could be arranged at very young ages, particularly among noble families where marriages were crucial tools for forging political alliances, consolidating land ownership, and ensuring the continuation of lineages. And among the peasantry, marriage might occur slightly later, often in the late teens or early 20s, but personal choice and romantic love were frequently secondary to practical considerations like family labor needs, dowries, or the joining of adjacent land parcels. Once married, a woman typically entered a long phase of her life dominated by the demands of reproduction. In an era lacking effective or church-sanctioned contraception, pregnancies often followed one another in relatively quick succession throughout her childbearing years. Large families were the norm, partly driven by the grim reality of high infant and child mortality rates. Having numerous offspring increased the statistical likelihood that at least some would survive to adulthood to contribute labor and continue the family line. This relentless cycle placed a considerable and recurring physical burden upon women. Childbirth itself represented perhaps the most perilous juncture in a medieval woman's existence. Maternal mortality rates were exceptionally high by modern standards. Women frequently succumbed to complications such as uncontrolled postpartum hemorrhage, sheer exhaustion from prolonged labor, infections like the dreaded childbed fever, puerperal sepsis, contracted due to unhygienic conditions, or obstructed labor where the baby could not be delivered naturally. Skilled medical intervention was virtually non-existent. Births were typically managed at home, attended by female relatives and experienced local midwives whose abilities were based on tradition rather than scientific understanding. For the approximately 90% of the population living as peasants in rural communities, women's lives were characterized by a demanding dual burden of labor. They were expected to participate fully in agricultural work alongside men, especially during peak seasons. This meant long hours spent planting seeds, stooping to weed fields under the hot sun, wielding sickles or scythes during the intense harvest period, and helping with threshing grain. This work was physically strenuous and essential to the family's economic survival. However, unlike their male counterparts, peasant women's work did not cease when they left the fields. They simultaneously shouldered the almost exclusive responsibility for a vast array of domestic tasks crucial for maintaining the household. This endless list included fetching water daily, gathering firewood, grinding grain into flour by hand using heavy quern stones, baking bread, a dietary staple, preparing daily meals over an open hearth, tending the kitchen garden which provided vital vegetables, preserving food for the lean winter months, cleaning the simple dwelling, spinning fibers like wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth, sewing and endlessly mending the family's few garments, and the constant care of infants and young children. Even women of the nobility, while exempt from manual field labor, faced significant responsibilities. A noble woman was typically expected to manage a large and complex household, overseeing numerous servants, managing budgets and supplies, cultivating social graces, and often possessing skills in needlework or perhaps basic literacy. When her husband was away, a frequent occurrence due to warfare, political duties, or pilgrimages, she might be entrusted with managing the entire estate, making important decisions regarding tenants and resources. However, her most crucial societal function was often perceived as producing legitimate heirs, especially sons, to inherit titles and property. Opportunities for women to pursue paths outside of marriage and domesticity were severely restricted. Formal education was inaccessible to all but a small elite, primarily women from the highest nobility or those destined for religious life. For most, literacy remained an unattainable skill. The primary alternative to marriage was entering a convent to become a nun. While convents could offer women a relatively safe environment, opportunities for education, spiritual devotion, and sometimes positions of administrative authority as an abbess, entry often required a substantial dowry from the woman's family, placing it beyond the reach of many. In terms of legal and economic standing, medieval women generally occupied a subordinate position relative to men. While specific laws and customs varied across regions and social classes, women were typically under the legal authority of their fathers before marriage, and their husbands thereafter femme covert. Their rights to own or inherit property independently, enter into contracts, sue in court, or even choose their own spouse were often limited or non-existent. Society was structured around male lineage and authority. This dependent status made certain life stages particularly precarious. Widowhood, while sometimes offering a woman unprecedented autonomy, could also spell disaster. A widow, especially one with young children, might face immense economic hardship if inheritance laws or her husband's will did not provide for her adequately. She might lose control of land or property and face intense pressure from her family or her late husband's family to remarry swiftly, often to a man chosen for strategic or economic reasons, rather than her own well-being or preference. Women who remained unmarried throughout their lives, often referred to as spinsters after the common female task of spinning thread, faced their own set of challenges. Without the social and economic framework of marriage, they often remained dependent on the charity or goodwill of relatives. If forced to support themselves, their options were usually limited to low-paid, often laborious work such as spinning, weaving, domestic service, brewing ale, or agricultural day labor. Now, they could easily become marginalized figures within a community structure centered firmly on the family unit. This potential for marginalization, particularly for women who lived alone, were elderly, possessed traditional healing knowledge, or otherwise deviated from expected norms, could make them vulnerable to suspicion and accusation. Midwives, herbal healers, wise women, widows, and the socially isolated were sometimes scapegoated during times of community crisis like famine, plague, or unexplained misfortune. Accusations of witchcraft involving harmful magic and alleged pacts with the devil, while peaking later, had roots in medieval anxieties about female power and nonconformity. Throughout their lives, medieval women were generally expected to cultivate and display specific virtues deemed appropriate for their sex. Religious teachings and social customs emphasized piety, chastity before marriage and fidelity within it, modesty in dress and behavior, obedience to male authority, father, husband, priest, lord, diligence in domestic duties, and, perhaps above all, quiet endurance of hardship. Open defiance of these norms was discouraged and could lead to social censure or worse. Acceptance of one's lot, however difficult, was often presented as a virtue. In conclusion, navigating everyday life as a woman in the Middle Ages typically involved traversing a path more constrained, laborious, and fraught with peril than that faced by most men. From the significant physical dangers associated with frequent childbirth to the unceasing demands of the dual burden of agricultural and domestic labor, coupled with limited educational and economic opportunities and a societal expectation of subservience, their existence demanded extraordinary resilience. While medieval women undoubtedly carved out spaces for agency, influence, and community, the historical backdrop reveals reality largely defined by hardship, vulnerability, and circumscribed horizons. We have wandered for some time now through the often dim and challenging landscape of everyday life in medieval Europe. We've lingered in the smoky confines of peasant huts, felt the chill seep in through wattle and daub walls, and imagined the rhythms of a world governed by sunlight, seasons, and the tolling of church bells. It has been a journey into a past both distant and starkly real in its struggles, an exploration of how the vast majority lived, day by laborious day, centuries ago. We've tried to understand the very texture of their existence. Recall the physical sensations, the persistent dampness seeping from packed earth floors, clinging to rough woolen clothes, making true dryness a rare luxury. Remember the biting drafts whistling through ill-fitting shutters or cracks in the walls, making winter indoors a true test of endurance against the pervasive cold. Think of the air, thick with wood smoke from the central hearth that offered warmth but also filled the single room with stinging fumes, mingling with the smells of cooking, unwashed bodies, animal proximity, and the nearby midden heap where waste accumulated. Picture the narrow, muddy streets of towns, treacherous underfoot, and occasionally hazardous from above due to the emptying of chamber pots. This was the immediate sensory world. Think back to the intimate, unwelcome presence of fleas and lice, a commonplace reality shared across social divides, leading to constant itching, irritated skin, and the potential spread of disease. Remember the grim state of oral health, the near absence of preventative care resulting in widespread tooth decay, painful abscesses, and the terrifying prospect of extraction by a barber surgeon using brute force with unsterilized tools like pliers or pelicans. Consider the medical landscape dominated by the ancient theory of humors, where treatments like bloodletting with lancets or leeches and harsh purges using emetics or laxatives were standard practice, often performed without understanding infection or truly alleviating pain. Remember the core diet, heavily reliant on grain manifesting as the ever-present pottage, perhaps a thick, slowly simmering stew of oats or barley, beans, and whatever roots were available, often bland, always basic, yet essential. Recall this being accompanied by dense, dark bread made from coarse flour, bread that served as both sustenance and sometimes even absorbed the meal as a plate, the trencher. Recall the rhythm of labor dictated by sunlight and seasons, the back-breaking toil of plowing heavy soil, sowing seed by hand, weeding bent over for hours, harvesting grain with a sickle and threshing with a flail, all performed with simple tools and immense physical effort. 6 long days a week, with little respite or safety net if illness or injury struck. Consider the all-encompassing influence of the medieval church, its doctrines shaping understanding of life, death, the cosmos, and one's place within it. Remember the mandatory attendance at Mass, the perceived power of the sacraments to convey grace, the constant awareness of sin, both original and personal, and the vivid, terrifying imagery of hell's eternal torments, used to enforce obedience and piety. Think of the economic weight of the tithe, the church's position as a major landowner, and the perilous consequences, both spiritual and physical, of being labeled a heretic for questioning established dogma. Recall also the specific constraints placed upon women, facing the dangers of frequent childbirth and the dual burden of labor within a deeply patriarchal structure. It paints a picture of life lived with a profound sense of vulnerability to the elements that govern their crops, comfort and health, vulnerability to the diseases that swept through communities without effective remedy, vulnerability to the rigid social hierarchies that dictated their place and obligations, and vulnerability to the doctrines that governed their souls and behavior. Endurance, necessity, community bonds, and deeply ingrained faith were perhaps the cornerstones supporting existence through the pervasive mud, toil, uncertainty, and fears that characterized much of the medieval era for the common person. But the tapestry of human history is vast and varied, woven with threads of countless different colors and textures. While the medieval period in Europe offers a compelling, if often harsh, glimpse into one particular way of life, countless other eras and cultures across the globe have faced their own unique sets of challenges and developed their own distinct ways of navigating the complexities of everyday existence. And so, our journey through the quiet details of the past continues, but it is time now to gently shift our focus, to lift our gaze from the fields and manners of medieval Europe. Let the sounds of the distant church bell marking the canonical hours fade into silence, Let the image of the low-slung thatched roof with smoke curling from a hole dissolve from view. We leave behind the world of serfs bound to the land, of knights clad in mail preoccupied with chivalry and warfare, of monks chanting Latin in secluded cloisters, and of women managing households amidst constant, demanding toil. We let go of the taste of weak ale and coarse bread, the feel of damp wool against the skin, the sound of the flail rhythmically striking sheaves on the threshing floor. The echoes of this specific time, with its unique blend of hardship, faith, and humanity, begin to soften as we prepare for a new historical setting. Our exploration of boring history, the often overlooked yet fundamental history of ordinary lives, daily routines, and common struggles, will now take us onwards, perhaps to a different continent, certainly to a different century. We will encounter new landscapes, perhaps arid deserts or human jungles instead of temperate forests and fields. We may find different social structures, beliefs about the cosmos, forms of governance, and technologies shaping daily life. The fundamental human needs for shelter, sustenance, community, health, and meaning persist across time, but the specific ways these needs were met and the particular obstacles faced will offer a fresh and distinct perspective on the human condition. The challenges encountered may be of a different nature. Perhaps the focus will shift from the obligations of feudalism to the pressures of a market economy or the rules of a complex empire. Perhaps the struggle will be less against the cold and damp and more against intense heat or monsoon rains. Maybe the prevalent fears will revolve around different spiritual beliefs, political instabilities, or environmental hazards. The cast of characters changes, the backdrop shifts dramatically, but our focus remains steadfastly on the fabric of the everyday, how people simply lived. Rest assured, the pace of our exploration will remain gentle, the descriptions detailed, aiming to provide a calm, immersive experience, suitable for quiet contemplation or drifting towards sleep. We will continue to delve into the boring but essential aspects of history, what ordinary people ate and wore, how they built their homes and managed their health, the nature of their work, their family structures, their beliefs and rituals. By examining these quiet, often unrecorded details, we gain a deeper, more nuanced appreciation for the diverse ways humans have adapted, endured, created meaning, and simply lived across the vast and varied landscape of the past. So let your mind remain open and relaxed as we conclude this extended visit to the medieval world. We pause here briefly, standing metaphorically at the edge of this era, having explored its shadows and acknowledged its realities. Allow the echoes of the lives we've just contemplated, the peasant farmer, the midwife, the barber surgeon, the devout parishioner, to settle peacefully. Prepare now to embark with us on a new exploration, ready for a fresh glimpse into the enduring, often quiet, yet always profound drama of everyday life in another corner of history. Now let us step much further back in time, leaving the muddy lanes and thatched roofs of medieval Europe far behind us in the mists of history. Our quiet journey into the details of everyday life takes us now to the heart of a vast, enduring, and profoundly influential civilization, ancient Rome. Prepare to adjust your focus to a different era, a different landscape. Imagine an empire of immense scale, stretching across diverse lands and peoples, all centered on a city that at its peak dwarfed any medieval counterpart. Rome itself, a sprawling, bustling metropolis of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, characterized by monumental stone architecture, temples, amphitheaters, public baths, crowded multi-story apartment blocks known as insulae, and an intricate network of paved stone roads connecting it all. Yet, beyond the monumental city, the empire relied absolutely on its vast agricultural countryside, the farms, villas, small towns and villages that produced the food and resources sustaining its immense population and legions. Here we encounter a different societal structure, a different sense of civic identity, and different technologies shaping the environment. Think less perhaps of the constant damp and wood smoke of a medieval hut, and more of engineered marvels like the great aqueducts relentlessly marching across hills and valleys on stone arches, carrying fresh water to teeming urban centers on an unprecedented scale. The daily challenges and fundamental human needs remain, but the context, the scale, and the physical world in which ordinary people lived their lives present a distinct departure from the medieval world we just explored. So let us begin to gently immerse ourselves in this ancient setting. We will consider the life of an ordinary Roman, whether dwelling amidst the noise and density of the capital city or living a quieter existence in the rural provinces, and uncover the mundane realities, the daily routines, and the common struggles that defined their existence within the vast and complex machinery of the Roman Empire. As dawn filters over the 7 hills or illuminates provincial towns across the vast Roman Empire, consciousness returns to individuals housed in vastly different circumstances. The experience of waking, the first sounds perceived, the immediate sensations of one's surroundings, these varied greatly. The ancient Roman world encompassed both the unprecedented density of its major cities and the sprawling quiet of its agricultural hinterlands. And shelter reflected this duality, particularly between the masses and the elite. For the overwhelming majority of urban dwellers, particularly in a city like Rome itself, morning began within the often cramped and noisy confines of an insula. Imagine a multi-story apartment block, typically built with timber frames, and brick or rubble infill rising several stories towards the sky. These buildings housed bustling shops, taverns, and workshops on their ground floors, while the levels above were densely packed with small apartments or single rooms rented out to artisans, laborers, clerks, and their families. Life inside these insulae was inherently communal and often lacked basic amenities, especially on the upper floors. Running water and private sanitation facilities were typically absent beyond the ground level. Residents would need to haul water laboriously up flights of stairs and carry down their accumulated waste in chamber pots. Walls were likely thin, offering little sound insulation from the neighbors above, below, and on all sides. Conversations, arguments, the cries of infants, the noises of small crafts, all would filter through, making true quiet a rarity. In stark contrast stood the domus, the private, single-family city residence of the wealthy elite, senators, successful merchants, high-ranking officials. These homes were usually designed facing inwards, often centered around an open courtyard or atrium, which provided light and air while buffering the occupants from the street noise. A domus could be lavishly decorated with mosaic floors, vibrant frescoes painted on the walls, and multiple specialized rooms. Critically, it often boasted features like running water, rudimentary underfloor heating, private bathing facilities, and indoor latrines, offering a level of comfort and privacy unimaginable to insula dwellers. And far removed from the urban intensity was the experience of waking in the countryside. Life on a rural villa, a large agricultural estate owned by the wealthy, or in the simpler farmsteads and villages scattered across the provinces, followed different rhythms. Dwellings might range from luxurious manor houses to basic huts for tenant farmers or slaves, but the density of population was far lower. Here the sounds of morning would be dominated by birdsong, the lowing of cattle, the crowing of roosters, a profound difference from the urban soundscape. Even before the sun fully illuminated the narrow streets between the tall insulae, the sounds of the Roman city would begin their daily crescendo. Perhaps the distant rumble of heavy ox carts, legally restricted from daytime passage but completing their nighttime deliveries of goods. The distinct calls of early rising street vendors setting up portable stalls to sell bread, hot sausages, drinks, or other necessities for the day. The sharp clatter of wooden shutters being thrown open, the scuffing sound of footsteps on the stone paving slabs below, indistinct shouts and conversations echoing between buildings, the city stirring en masse. Within the crowded reality of the insula, personal privacy was an almost non-existent luxury. Living spaces were small, often just 1 or 2 rooms per family. Shared walls meant intimate proximity to neighbors' lives. Access frequently involved negotiating dark, narrow, common stairwells and exterior balconies. Even essential bodily functions required navigating this shared space, either descending multiple flights to use often foul-smelling public latrines, typically multi-seated affairs offering no seclusion, or resorting to the convenience and hazard to those below of emptying a chamber pot from an upper window. Waking up meant instantly rejoining the throng. Thus, the Roman morning dawned with diverse sensory inputs depending heavily on dwelling and location. For most city inhabitants, it arrived amidst the noise, smells, and close-packed humanity of the insula, an immediate immersion into the collective bustle. For the privileged few in their spacious domus, or those residing in the relative tranquility of the countryside, the day might begin more gently, with greater separation from the surrounding world, but for all it signified the start of another day navigating the intricate, often challenging, realities of life within the Roman sphere. One of the most defining features of Roman urban life, standing in fascinating contrast to some other daily realities we might explore, was the highly developed culture of public bathing. The Romans, perhaps more than any other ancient civilization, elevated communal bathing to an art form and a social necessity. They constructed vast and often architecturally magnificent bath complexes, the thermae, which were prominent features not just in the city of Rome itself, but in towns and military forts throughout their sprawling empire. These establishments offered far more than just an opportunity to get clean. The great public baths served as vital social hubs, generally accessible to almost everyone, often for a very modest entrance fee or sometimes even free due to the sponsorship of emperors or wealthy patrons. Within their walls, people from various social strata could mingle, though distinct areas or times might sometimes cater to different groups or sexes. The baths were bustling centers for exercise, relaxation, conversation, conducting business deals, listening to readings or philosophical discussions, playing games, enjoying snacks, and, of course, engaging in the elaborate ritual of bathing itself. For many Romans, a visit to the baths was a regular, almost daily, part of their afternoon routine. The bathing process typically followed a specific, well-established sequence, guiding the bather through a series of rooms with carefully controlled temperatures. This progression was designed to gradually open the skin's pores, facilitate cleansing, and invigorate the body. A common routine might begin with some light exercise in the palestra, an open-air courtyard often attached to the complex. Afterwards, bathers would move to the apoditerium, the changing room, to disrobe and store their clothes. From there, they proceeded into the tepidarium, a moderately warm room that allowed the body to acclimatize before entering the heat. The next step was the caldarion, the hot room, often featuring pools of hot water and heated by an underfloor system called a hypocaust, which circulated hot air beneath the floor and through the walls. The intense heat and steam induced profuse sweating. Here, bathers would often anoint their skin with olive oil. This oil, along with accumulated dirt and dead skin cells, was then meticulously scraped off using a stregion, a curved metal implement. This scraping action was the primary method of cleansing, as soap in its modern form was not commonly used for personal washing. After the intense heat and scraping in the caldarium, the ritual culminated with a move to the frigidarium. This room contained a large pool filled with unheated, refreshingly cold water. Plunging into the frigidarium served to close the pores, invigorate the senses, and cool the body down after the heat treatments. Many larger bath complexes also boasted impressive open-air swimming pools, natitio, as well as amenities like libraries, gardens, shops, and spaces for socializing, transforming the simple act of bathing into a comprehensive social and recreational experience. Imagine the atmosphere within these grand public spaces. The sounds would be a cacophony, the constant splashing and dripping of water, the low murmur and loud calls of hundreds of voices echoing in the high-vaulted, often marble-clad halls, the distinctive scraping sound of strigils on skin, perhaps the shouts of masseurs or vendors selling refreshments. The air would be humid and warm, thick with steam, carrying a complex mixture of smells, fragrant oils and perfumes used by some bathers, the underlying odor of warm bodies and sweat, the damp scent of stone and water, perhaps a faint mineral tang from the water source itself. Yet this sophisticated culture of public hygiene stood in stark contrast to the often rudimentary nature of private sanitation, particularly for the majority of the urban population dwelling in multi-story insulae. While the wealthy occupants of a private domus might enjoy the luxury of indoor latrines flushed with running water, most apartment dwellers relied on simple chamber pots, often just basic earthenware vessels known as kakabadi, kept within their small living quarters. Managing the disposal of waste from these pots was a constant and unpleasant necessity in crowded city conditions. Disposing of the contents often involved carrying the full chamber pot down multiple flights of dark, narrow stairs to be emptied into large communal storage jars, Judolia sometimes located at the base of the building or into designated cesspits. Alternatively, and frequently, residents might simply opt for the quickest method, dumping the waste directly out of a window onto the street or alleyway below, a practice that contributed significantly to the filth and foul odors of many residential areas, and posed an obvious hazard to pedestrians. For those needing facilities while out and about, or for insular residents without even a chamber pot, public latrines, 40K, offered a solution, albeit one lacking entirely in privacy. These were typically communal arrangements featuring long benches made of stone or wood, perforated with multiple keyhole-shaped openings. These benches were situated directly over a channel through which water, often diverted from the aqueducts or bath outflows, flowed continuously, carrying the waste away into the city's main sewer system, such as Rome's famous Cloaca Maxima. Users sat side by side, with no partitions between them. Hygiene practices associated with these public latrines also highlight ancient Roman attitudes. Lacking toilet paper, the common method for cleaning oneself involved using a tersorium, or axoluspangium. This consisted of a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. Remarkably, this tool was communal. It would typically be kept in a container filled with salt water or vinegar near the latrine benches, used, rinsed in the same solution, and then left for the next person. The shared use of such an intimate cleaning tool underscores vastly different notions of personal space and hygiene compared to modern times. This juxtaposition reveals a significant paradox within Roman society. They possessed remarkable engineering skills, evidenced by the aqueducts delivering vast quantities of fresh water for public use in fountains, baths, and flushing sewers. Infrastructure promoting public health on a grand scale. Simultaneously, however, the private sanitation and waste disposal methods available to the majority of the urban populace remained primitive and often highly unsanitary, creating conditions where filth and disease could easily spread within densely packed residential quarters. In conclusion, Roman hygiene presents a complex and contrasting picture. The magnificent public baths stand as testament to a culture that valued communal well-being, cleanliness, and leisure, integrating bathing deeply into the social fabric. Yet, this existed alongside inadequate private sanitation for the masses, leading to a reality where sophisticated public infrastructure coexisted with challenging levels of domestic filth. It serves as a reminder that understanding everyday life in the past requires looking beyond the monumental achievements to the often less visible and sometimes contradictory details of ordinary existence. Just as shelter and hygiene revealed much about Roman life, so too did the daily rituals surrounding food and drink. Sustenance was naturally a fundamental concern, but what constituted a typical meal, how it was prepared, and the social context in which it was eaten varied enormously across the vast Roman world. Social status, wealth, geography, and whether one lived in the bustling city or the quiet countryside all played a crucial role in shaping the Roman diet, a diet built on Mediterranean staples but also flavored with unique and pungent ingredients. At the foundation of Roman eating habits supporting rich and poor alike lay the core products of Mediterranean agriculture. Grains were paramount, with wheat being preferred, but barley also widely consumed. These were most commonly processed into bread, which varied significantly in quality, from coarse dark loaves for the common people to finer whiter varieties for the affluent, or cooked into a thick porridge or gruel known as pulse, a simple, filling staple. Alongside grains, common vegetables included cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce, turnips, and legumes like lentils and beans. Olive oil was the essential fat, used generously in cooking as a dressing and even for lamps and skincare. Wine, typically diluted with water, served as the standard everyday beverage for nearly all social classes. Perhaps the single most characteristic flavoring agent in Roman cuisine, adding a distinctive savory depth to a vast array of dishes, was garum. This potent fermented fish sauce was ubiquitous, used much as salt is today to enhance taste. Its production involved layering whole small fish, or the entrails and blood of larger fish, with substantial quantities of salt in large vats, then leaving this mixture to break down and ferment under the heat of the sun for several weeks or months. While the production process generated an incredibly strong, pungent odor that required facilities to be located away from towns, the resulting amber liquid provided a complex, salty, umami flavor highly prized by Roman tastes, appearing in everything from elaborate sauces to simple vegetable dishes. For the average Roman citizen, particularly the urban poor residing in crowded, insular apartments that often lacked proper cooking facilities, daily meals were typically simple, inexpensive, and repetitive. Breakfast, if taken at all, might consist merely of a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or water. The main meal, often eaten around midday, would likely be pulse, the basic grain porridge, possibly enriched with some chopped vegetables, beans, or lentils for substance. Coarse bread remained a constant companion. Meat was a luxury seldom afforded, or perhaps enjoyed only during religious festivals or special occasions. Small amounts of cheese, a few olives, or an occasional egg might provide welcome but infrequent variety. The dining experience of the wealthy Romans stood in dramatic contrast. Elaborate dinner parties, known as convivia, were important social events showcasing the host's wealth and status. These meals typically involved multiple courses, beginning with appetizers, which might include oysters, shellfish, seasoned vegetables, eggs, and olives. These were followed by a succession of main dishes, prime mensae, featuring expensive meats like roasted dormice, game birds, peacock, pheasant, suckling pig, intricate preparations of fish and seafood, all accompanied by complex sauces heavily seasoned with herbs, spices, honey, wine, and, of course, garum. These extravagant banquets often concluded with a dessert course, secundae mensae, of fresh or dried fruits, nuts, and pastries sweetened with honey, as refined sugar was unknown. Throughout the lengthy meal, wine flowed freely, often choice vintages, and entertainment such as musicians, dancers, poets, or acrobats might perform between courses. For guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables, eating with their fingers or small utensils, in a setting far removed from the simple functionality of a poor family's meal. Given that many urban dwellers, especially those in the upper floors of insulae, lacked private kitchens, eating outside the home was common. Establishments known as thermopolia functioned much like modern snack bars or taverns. These typically had L-shaped counters opening directly onto the street, often with large earthenware jars sunk into the counter, containing ready-to-eat food or wine. Here one could quickly purchase inexpensive hot dishes like stews or sausages, as well as bread, cheese, olives, nuts, fruit, and cups of wine. Numerous street vendors also sold various foodstuffs, providing convenient options for those needing a quick, cheap meal in the bustling city. In essence, Roman meals were built upon a foundation of grains, olive oil, wine, and vegetables, often unified by the distinctive salty tang of garum. However, beyond these shared basics, a vast gulf separated the simple, repetitive, and often meager fare of the common population from the diverse, extravagant, and leisurely banquets enjoyed by the wealthy elite. From a humble bowl of pulse consumed quickly in a noisy apartment block to an elaborate roasted peacock served at a reclining dinner party, food and eating habits vividly reflected the social hierarchy and the daily economic realities of life across the Roman world. While vast agricultural estates formed the productive backbone of the Roman Empire, its cities, particularly Rome itself, pulsed with a different kind of lifeblood, the constant thrum of commerce, craft production, and specialized labor. Unlike the seasonal rhythms dominating rural life, the Roman city maintained a more consistent hum of activity. Its streets were not merely passages, but active workplaces, lined with countless shops and workshops where the goods and services necessary for urban existence were created, traded, and maintained from early morning until dusk. Strolling through the bustling streets of a Roman city, one would encounter a kaleidoscope of occupations. The essential work of bakers, the pistores, often began before dawn, their workshops filled with the rhythmic sound of grinding grain and the heat radiating from large wood-fire ovens, producing the daily bread vital for feeding the populace. Nearby, the sharp, rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal might signal the workshop of a blacksmith, a faber ferrarius, forging tools, nails, hinges, chariot fittings, or even weapons. Potters skillfully shaped clay on wheels, producing the ubiquitous amphorae for transporting wine and oil, as well as everyday tableware and lamps. Elsewhere, weavers operated looms, transforming thread into textiles for clothing and furnishings. Tanners, the coriarii, undertook the chemically intensive and notoriously pungent process of converting raw animal hides into durable leather for shoes, belts, shields, and countless other uses. Stonemasons meticulously carved inscriptions onto monuments or shaped blocks for constructing grand public buildings and temples. One would also find merchants, mercatores, overseeing goods arriving from distant corners of the empire, and numerous shopkeepers, tabernarii, presiding over small stalls or shops selling everything from groceries and wine to pottery and cloth. However, casting a long shadow over nearly every facet of Roman labor, from the most grueling manual tasks to highly skilled crafts and domestic service, was the institution of slavery. Enslaved people constituted a significant percentage of the population, particularly in urban centers and on large rural estates. Their forced labor was not merely supplementary, it was deeply integrated into and arguably fundamental to the functioning of the Roman economy and the lifestyle enjoyed by its citizens. Their presence was ubiquitous, their lack of freedom an accepted norm. The tasks performed by enslaved individuals spanned an enormous range. They provided the brute force for massive construction projects like roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, toiled under horrific conditions in mines and quarries, and cultivated crops on vast agricultural estates. Within households, enslaved people served as cooks, cleaners, launderers, nurses for children, hairdressers, and personal attendants. Many were also highly skilled artisans working in workshops alongside free craftspeople, while others possessed literacy and numeracy skills, serving as clerks, scribes, administrators, and even managers for their masters' businesses. The workshops where much of this craft production took place were typically small spaces, often just rooms on the ground floor of insulae, opening directly onto the bustling street. This provided necessary light and ventilation and allowed customers to easily see and purchase goods. Imagine the sensory environment, the constant noise, the whirring and grinding of mills, the sharp tapping of chisels on stone, the rhythmic thud of weavers' looms, the hiss of hot metal being quenched in water, the chatter and bargaining of customers and workers. Each trade contributed its own distinct aroma to the street, the comforting smell of baking bread, the sharp chemical tang from a dyer's vat, the acrid scent of the tanner's yard, the earthy smell of wet clay. The public markets and forums, like Trajan's market in Rome, were even more concentrated hubs of noise and activity. Picture crowded colonnades and open squares filled with vendors calling out their wares from behind temporary stalls or permanent shop fronts. Here one could find almost anything. Fresh vegetables piled high, cages of live poultry, sacks of grain, jars of wine and olive oil, pottery of all shapes and sizes, colorful textiles, imported spices, perfumes, glassware, and metalwork. The air would be thick with a medley of smells: roasting meats, exotic spices, fresh produce, fragrant flowers, mingling perhaps with the less pleasant odors of live animals, refuse, and the press of the crowd itself. Roman urban work therefore presented a dynamic, noisy, and often odoriferous environment driven by a complex interplay of specialized crafts, commerce, and services. It was a world built upon the contributions of free citizens and freedmen pursuing their trades, but also fundamentally reliant on the coerced labor of a vast, enslaved population. The ceaseless activity within its workshops and marketplaces formed the vibrant essential pulse sustaining the intricate and demanding life of the Roman city. Beyond the details of housing, work, or meals, simply existing within the confines of a major Roman city, especially Rome itself, meant navigating an environment of intense and often overwhelming sensory input. This ancient urban landscape presented a constant barrage of sounds and smells, coupled with potential dangers, particularly after dark, creating an atmosphere vastly different from the relative quiet of the countryside or the more sanitized environments of many modern cities. It was a world demanding a certain level of acclimatization. During daylight hours, the Roman city resonated with a near-constant wall of sound. Imagine the perpetual background noise, the loud calls of street vendors hawking everything from food to repairs, echoing between the tall apartment blocks. Picture the din of countless workshops spilling out onto the streets, the rhythmic clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the grating sound of stonemasons' chisels, the whirring of potters' wheels, the shouts of artisans instructing apprentices. Add to this the general hubbub of a dense population, conversations, arguments, children playing, the shuffling and footsteps of crowds, and the sounds of animals like braying mules or barking dogs. True silence would have been a rare commodity. This cacophony of sound was matched by an equally complex and often pungent olfactory landscape. The smells of a Roman city were numerous and pervasive. The sharp, fermented tang of garum, the ubiquitous fish sauce, might waft from production areas or kitchens. More widespread, unfortunately, was the unavoidable odor of human and animal waste, emanating from overflowing cesspits, poorly cleaned public latrines, or the contents of chamber pots frequently dumped into the streets or alleys. Rotting garbage accumulated in corners added its own unpleasant contribution. Mingling with these were smoke from countless cooking fires and workshops, the specific smells of various trades like tanning leather, occasional wafts of incense from temples, or perhaps perfumes worn by the wealthy attempting, often vainly, to create a small pocket of pleasant air. As the daylight began to wane, the sensory profile of the city would subtly shift. While the noise from workshops might diminish, taverns and bars could become louder and more boisterous. The thinning crowds might allow individual sounds, a late-night argument, footsteps on the stone pavement, the closing of heavy shutters, to echo more distinctly through the narrow streets and canyons formed by the tall insulae. But the most profound change brought by the end of the day was the arrival of deep, pervasive darkness. Modern notions of street lighting were non-existent in ancient Rome. While torches or oil lamps might illuminate the entrances of wealthy homes or major public squares during festivals, the vast majority of the city's residential streets, alleys, and passageways plunged into almost complete darkness after sunset. This lack of light created significant hazards. Navigating the often uneven paving stones, avoiding obstacles like refuse piles or sleeping animals became difficult and treacherous without a personal light source like a torch or lantern. More concerningly, the darkness provided ample cover for criminal activity. Robbery and assault were real dangers for anyone venturing out alone after dark. Wealthier Romans would likely not travel at night without an escort of slaves carrying lights, and perhaps even armed guards for protection. For ordinary inhabitants of the insulae, nighttime excursions were often avoided, unless absolutely necessary. There was also the persistent, unpleasant risk of being hit by waste casually thrown from an upper-story window into the darkened street below. Furthermore, the ever-present danger of fire spreading rapidly through the densely packed, often timber-framed apartment blocks seemed even more menacing in the darkness. Life within a major Roman city was thus an experience defined by constant sensory engagement, often bordering on overload. By day, it was a realm of incessant noise and a potent mixture of smells, reflecting the intense concentration of people, animals, and activities. By night, it transformed into a landscape of deep darkness, bringing with it different anxieties related to personal safety, accidents, and the potential for disaster. It highlights a daily reality demanding resilience and caution, a world operating with a raw intensity, far removed from the controlled environments we often inhabit today. When sickness or injury inevitably afflicted inhabitants of the Roman world, the approaches taken to understand and treat these conditions were built upon a foundation laid largely by Greek predecessors but significantly expanded and codified by Roman practitioners and thinkers. Figures like Galen of Pergamon, a prominent physician, surgeon, and philosopher active in the 2nd century AD, exerted enormous influence, with his extensive writings becoming the cornerstone of Western medical knowledge for well over a millennium. Roman medicine thus represented a complex blend of established theory, practical experience, herbal lore, and religious attitudes towards health and healing. Much like the later medieval period, the dominant theoretical framework guiding Roman medical thought remained the ancient concept of the four humors. Health was believed to depend on the harmonious balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile within the body. Consequently, illness was generally interpreted as a state of humoral imbalance, an excess, deficiency, or corruption of one or more of these essential fluids. Diagnoses, therefore, often involved assessing symptoms to determine the nature of the imbalance, considering factors like pulse, urine color and consistency, and sometimes even astrological alignments, with treatments aimed at restoring the body's natural equilibrium. A significant portion of Roman medical practice focused on gentler, preventative, or corrective measures related to lifestyle and natural remedies. Physicians routinely advised patients on dietary adjustments, recommending certain foods thought to possess qualities hot, cold, wet, dry, that could counteract the perceived humoral disturbance. Exercise, bathing routines, and overall lifestyle were also considered important for maintaining balance. Furthermore, herbal medicine was highly developed, drawing upon centuries of accumulated knowledge regarding the therapeutic properties of various plants, roots, and minerals, meticulously catalogued in works like Dioscorides' influential De Materia Medica. Alongside these approaches, Roman medicine, particularly driven by the practical needs of healing soldiers wounded in battle, developed relatively advanced surgical techniques for its time. Roman surgeons possessed a diverse toolkit of specialized instruments, often crafted from bronze or iron, including various types of scalpels, hooks, bone levers, probes, catheters, specula, surgical saws, and drills. They demonstrated considerable skill in treating battlefield wounds, extracting weapons fragments, setting complex bone fractures using splints and traction, performing amputations when necessary, draining abscesses, and even undertaking delicate procedures such as operations for bladder stones or cataracts. However, while Roman surgical practice and anatomical knowledge gleaned by Galen primarily through dissecting animals like apes, pigs, and goats, as human dissection was generally taboo, might seem more developed in some respects than in later medieval times, crucial limitations persisted. The fundamental understanding of disease remained anchored in the potentially flawed humoral theory. Critically, just like their medieval successors, Roman physicians and surgeons had no knowledge of germ theory, the existence of microorganisms and their role in causing infection and contagious disease was entirely unknown. Consequently, the importance of antiseptic procedures and sterilization was not recognized. This lack of understanding about infection meant that even skilled surgical interventions carried enormous risks. Instruments were typically wiped clean but not sterilized. Wounds were susceptible to severe infection from bacteria present on skin, instruments, or dressings. Furthermore, all surgical procedures, from tooth extraction to major amputations, had to be performed without the benefit of effective anesthesia. While substances like opium poppy extracts, mandrake root, or henbane might have been used attempting to dull sensation or induce a stupor, they were unreliable and insufficient for eliminating the severe pain of surgery, demanding immense fortitude from the patient. As a result, despite the theoretical frameworks and practical skills possessed by Roman medical practitioners, their ability to cure many common and serious illnesses remained severely limited. Infectious diseases were rampant and often deadly. Malaria plagued many regions, tuberculosis was widespread, and outbreaks of diseases like typhoid fever, dysentery, and possibly smallpox could devastate populations. Malnutrition could weaken the poor, increasing their susceptibility. Infant and child mortality rates continued to be tragically high. For a vast number of ailments, Roman medicine could offer little more than attempts to manage symptoms, provide basic supportive care, or simply advise trust in nature or appeals to healing deities like Asclepius. In essence, Roman medicine represented a fascinating combination of detailed empirical observation, especially in anatomy and surgery, albeit with flawed interpretations, unwavering adherence to the ancient humoral doctrine, a rich tradition of herbal pharmacology, and practical skills honed by necessity, particularly in military contexts. Yet, despite its relative sophistication compared to earlier times, it operated within profound limitations imposed by the lack of understanding of infection and the absence of truly curative treatments for most major diseases. Sickness remained a formidable and often fatal adversary in the Roman world, reminding us that even great empires were ultimately vulnerable to the invisible forces of biology. Beyond the structured routines of work, family life, or grand public spectacles, the rhythm of everyday Roman existence was deeply infused with informal socializing. In the often cramped and bustling environment of the city, opportunities for casual interaction, relaxation, and simple diversions were woven into the very fabric of public spaces. For the ordinary Roman citizen or inhabitant, much of their social life unfolded not in private residences, but out amidst the energy of the streets, squares, and numerous local establishments. The streets and public squares, or forums, themselves served as vital social arenas. Given that private living quarters, especially in the multi-story insulae, were often small and crowded, public spaces became natural extensions of the home. Neighbors might linger to exchange gossip while drawing water from a neighborhood fountain. Artisans could converse with customers or fellow tradespeople just outside their workshops, and children played simple games like tag or knucklebones amidst the general flow of pedestrians and carts. These thoroughfares were channels for community connection as much as for movement. But in these streets were countless small establishments catering to daily needs and social impulses. Taverns, bars, and cookshops known by various names like capanae, papina, or tabernae were exceptionally common, particularly in densely populated urban areas. Often simple, perhaps dimly lit spaces opening directly onto the street, they served cheap wine, basic hot and cold foods, and provided a readily available place for people to gather, talk, and pass the time away from the demands of work or the confines of small lodgings. Within these taverns, or sometimes spilling out into nearby alleys or squares, certain pastimes were especially popular among the common populace. Drinking wine, typically diluted with water, was a near universal aspect of Roman social life, and taverns were primary venues for its consumption. Gambling, despite periodic legal disapproval, was another widespread passion. Games of chance played with dice, tesserae, or marked knucklebones tally were avidly pursued, often accompanied by betting and lively disputes. Above all, these spaces fostered conversation, the sharing of news, rumors, jokes, and grievances, forming the vital connective tissue of community life. While the Roman elite certainly participated in aspects of public life, attending the baths, visiting the forum, or enjoying public games, their private leisure often took different forms. Elaborate, multi-course dinner parties, convivia, hosted in their spacious homes featuring fine food, wine, and entertainment like musicians or poets, offered a more exclusive and controlled social setting. Attending performances in dedicated theaters or odeons was another elite pastime. While people of all classes might attend the great spectacles in the Colosseum or Circus Maximus, the daily, informal social world of the average Roman revolved more centrally around these street-level interactions and tavern gatherings. In essence, the social pulse of the ordinary Roman city dweller beat most strongly in its public and semi-public spaces. The streets, squares, markets, fountains, and numerous small taverns provided the essential backdrop for everyday interaction, simple relaxation, and the fundamental human need for connection. It was here, amidst the general noise and activity of urban life, that friendships were maintained, news was exchanged, and the community found outlets for leisure and companionship, offering brief respites from the labor and challenges of their daily existence. And so, our brief immersion in the daily realities of the Roman world draws to a close. We've considered the crowded life within city insulae, the social ritual of the public baths standing beside basic private sanitation, the staple foods flavored with pungent garum, the ceaseless activity of workshops relying on both free and enslaved labor, and the limitations faced when confronting illness, a complex picture of a powerful civilization's everyday existence. Now, however, our journey through the quiet corridors of history shifts direction. We move forward significantly in time, leaving the ancient Mediterranean world behind us. Let us travel onward from Rome, advancing through the centuries, drawing closer, step by step, towards times that might feel slightly more familiar, yet still hold their own distinct challenges and hardships. Prepare to explore the everyday struggles faced by ordinary people in another era, shaped by different technologies, beliefs, and social structures. Let the images of Roman forums and aqueducts gently fade as we attune ourselves to the rhythms and realities of a different point in the vast continuum of the past. Now let us leap forward again through the centuries, arriving much closer to our own time, yet entering a world undergoing perhaps the most rapid and fundamental transformation in human history. We find ourselves in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, at the dawn and heightening intensity of the Industrial Revolution. Imagine the landscape increasingly altered by human ingenuity and industry. Picture the rise of factories, often powered by steam, their tall chimneys beginning to punctuate the skyline. See the rapid expansion of towns and cities, drawing populations away from the familiar rhythms of agricultural life and into new, often densely packed urban environments built around these centers of production. This era marks a profound shift from the pre-industrial societies we have previously visited. For growing numbers of people, life's cadence becomes dictated less by the sun, seasons, and soil, and more by the factory clock, the relentless pace of machinery, and the demands of wage labor. A different kind of everyday existence, with new challenges and opportunities, take shape. Let us now quietly begin to explore the realities of daily life forged in this crucible of change, the conditions faced by ordinary men, women, and children as they navigated the emergence of the modern industrial world. In the burgeoning industrial towns that marked the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the familiar rhythm of rural life began to fade for many, replaced by a new, more demanding tempo. The day no longer reliably commenced with the first rays of sunlight warming the fields, but often started much earlier in darkness, prompted by the insistent summons of a factory bell or the piercing shriek of a steam whistle. This artificial call to labor echoed through crowded streets, rousing men, women, and even young children from their brief rest to prepare for another long shift within the imposing walls of the mill or factory. So imagine stepping through the factory gates, perhaps after a hurried walk through damp, poorly lit streets. The immediate sensation would often be an assault on the senses. A low rumble perceived from outside would crescendo into a deafening, ceaseless roar upon entering the main work floor. Picture vast, cavernous rooms, perhaps dimly illuminated by gaslight or small windows coated with grime, filled end to end with hulking machinery, spinning frames, power looms, steam engines, all clattering, pounding, whirring, and vibrating in a relentless mechanical symphony. The air itself might feel heavy, thick with airborne fibers like cotton dust, choked with the smell of machine oil, coal smoke, damp materials, and the close odor of numerous bodies working in confined spaces. Work within this environment was fundamentally reshaped by the machinery it served. Unlike the varied, seasonal tasks of farming or the skilled, paced work of traditional artisans, factory labor often involved performing the same, single, repetitive action for hours on end. Dictated entirely by the pace of the machine, an individual might be responsible solely for tying broken threads on a spinning frame, feeding raw materials into a feeder, operating a specific lever, or simply watching a machine for faults. Personal autonomy over the pace and nature of work dissolved. The worker became synchronized to the mechanism, an interchangeable part in a larger process. The duration of this labor was typically punishing. Work days of 12, 14, or even 16 hours were the standard, stretching across 6 days of the week. Timekeeping was rigid, governed by the factory clock and enforced by overseers whose job was to maintain production levels. Strict rules often governed behavior within the factory walls. Fines could be levied for tardiness, for talking, for taking unauthorized breaks, or for making errors that might slow production or damage the expensive machinery. Breaks were minimal, often brief pauses taken while standing at one's workstation, offering little real respite. The system demanded relentless endurance above all else. This demanding environment was also fraught with physical danger. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent in these early factories. Machinery frequently featured exposed, rapidly moving belts, gears, pulleys, and shafts, creating constant hazards. Workers risked horrific injuries. Fingers, hands, or limbs could be caught and crushed or torn off. Long hair or loose clothing could become entangled, pulling the worker into the mechanism. The air quality was often abysmal, particularly in textile mills, where cotton or wool dust filled the atmosphere, leading to chronic and debilitating respiratory diseases like bisonosis or brown lung. Poor lighting increased the risk of accidents, and the presence of flammable materials made catastrophic fires a constant threat. Tragically, children were not spared from this harsh reality. Indeed, they formed a substantial and exploited segment of the early industrial workforce. Their perceived dexterity and small size made them particularly sought after for certain tasks, such as picers who crawled beneath dangerous moving machinery to repair broken threads, or scavengers who picked up fallen scraps of cotton from the floor. These children endured the same excessively long hours, the same hazardous conditions, and the same strict discipline as adult workers, all while receiving significantly lower wages. For countless young people, the years normally devoted to growth, play, and education were instead consumed by monotonous, dangerous factory labor. This entire system represented a profound rupture from the agrarian and craft-based ways of life that had dominated for centuries. The intimate connection to the land, the changing seasons, and the natural cycles of daylight and darkness was severed. Workers lost control over their time, their pace of work, and often the skills they employed. Life became governed by the artificial constructs of the clock, the relentless rhythm of the steam engine, the directives of the factory owner or overseer, and the often unhealthy, noisy, and confining environment of the industrial workplace itself. It fostered a new kind of dependence and demanded a different form of human endurance. In conclusion, the dawn of the industrial age ushered in a new era of work for millions, fundamentally altering the patterns of daily existence, waking not to the sun but to the factory's summons, enduring excessively long hours immersed in the deafening clamor and constant peril of early machinery, performing endlessly repetitive tasks dictated by the mechanism's pace. This became the defining experience. Life for the factory worker was synchronized to a new master, the relentless, demanding, and profoundly transformative rhythm of the industrial machine. The immense pull of employment in the newly established factories led to an unprecedented migration during the Industrial Revolution. People flocked from the countryside to rapidly growing towns and cities, seeking work and opportunity. However, this explosive, often unplanned urban growth frequently overwhelmed the capacity to provide adequate housing and basic services, resulting in the creation of densely populated, impoverished neighborhoods where living conditions for the working class could be exceptionally bleak and unhealthy. For vast numbers of factory workers and their families, home was a small space within a crowded tenement building. These were often hastily constructed, multi-story structures designed to house as many people as possible, or sometimes older, larger houses subdivided internally into numerous tiny, single-room dwellings. Living spaces were typically cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated, offering little privacy or comfort. It was common for an entire family to live, sleep, cook, and eat within the confines of a single small room, shared perhaps with lodgers to help pay the rent. Essential amenities that we consider basic necessities today were almost entirely lacking in these tenements. Running water piped directly into individual dwellings was virtually unknown for the working poor. Instead, water for drinking, cooking, and washing had to be laboriously carried, usually by women or children from a communal source, perhaps a single pump or standpipe, located in a shared courtyard or down the street. These public water sources were often intermittent and highly vulnerable to contamination from nearby waste or polluted ground. Sanitation facilities were equally inadequate and often appalling. Private indoor toilets were unheard of. Residents typically relied on shared outdoor privies, often little more than simple pits dug in a courtyard or basement, serving numerous families. These facilities were frequently insufficient for the number of users, poorly maintained, rarely emptied, and often overflowed, creating foul odors and leaching waste into the surrounding ground, further threatening water supplies. Managing human waste generated within individual rooms, usually collected in chamber pots, posed a constant, unpleasant challenge. Dealing with household refuse and waste, including the contents of chamber pots, was a major problem in these densely packed neighborhoods. Overflowing cesspits contaminated the ground. There were often no organized systems for garbage collection, leading residents to dump refuse, ashes, and other waste directly into narrow alleys, courts, or even the streets themselves. This accumulated filth attracted rats and other vermin, created pervasive stenches, and further contributed to the deeply unsanitary conditions under which people lived. These crowded, damp, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary living conditions, often combined with inadequate nutrition resulting from low wages, created fertile ground for the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Tuberculosis, known grimly as consumption, thrived in close quarters, spreading easily through airborne droplets from coughing. Waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid fever caused devastating and terrifying epidemics, sweeping through communities reliant on contaminated water sources. Other infectious diseases like smallpox, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and respiratory illnesses, exacerbated by damp housing and air pollution, claimed countless lives, particularly among infants and young children, leading to tragically high mortality rates in these industrial slums. Beyond the immediate living quarters, the wider urban environment presented its own health hazards. The air itself was often thick and heavy with pollution. Countless factories burned coal to power their steam engines, while homes relied on coal fires for heating and cooking, spewing vast quantities of black smoke and soot into the atmosphere. A grimy film often coated buildings, streets, and inevitably the lungs of the inhabitants, contributing to respiratory ailments and casting a gloomy, smoggy pall over many industrial centers, blocking sunlight and fouling the air breathed by everyone. Water sources faced relentless contamination. Rivers and canals flowing through or near these burgeoning industrial towns frequently served as open sewers, receiving untreated human waste from overflowing privies and inadequate drainage systems. They also became dumping grounds for noxious industrial effluent, chemical waste from dye works or tanneries, debris from mills, and other pollutants, rendering the water toxic, foul-smelling, and utterly unsuitable for drinking, washing, or even recreational use. Access to clean, safe water was a luxury few factory workers enjoyed. While life in earlier periods, such as medieval times, certainly involved hardships, poor sanitation, and vulnerability to disease, the urban squalor brought about by the early Industrial Revolution represented a distinct and intensified form of human misery. The sheer density of population crammed into hastily built, inadequate housing, combined with the overwhelming scale of industrial pollution fouling the air and water, and the rapid transmission of epidemic diseases like cholera through compromised infrastructure, created a uniquely challenging and often lethal urban environment, different in kind from the more dispersed, organic patterns of filth found in a pre-industrial village or town. Therefore, for many individuals and families drawn to the promise of work in the new industries, migrating to the city meant exchanging the hardships of rural life for a different, often more dangerous, set of urban challenges. Daily existence was frequently lived out in cramped, dark, damp tenements, lacking basic sanitation, surrounded by heavily polluted air and contaminated water supplies. These grim conditions inevitably fostered rampant disease, contributing to shortened lifespans and high death rates, painting a stark and sobering picture of the human cost that accompanied the transformative power of the industrial age. Our journey through the quiet, often difficult corridors of everyday history now draws to a close for this exploration. When we have lingered in different eras, the muddy fields and smoky huts of medieval times, characterized by feudal bonds and the pervasive influence of the church, the bustling streets and grand baths of ancient Rome, built on intricate infrastructure and widespread slavery, and the clattering factories and crowded tenements of the early Industrial Revolution, marking a profound shift towards mechanized labor and urban living. We've attempted to glimpse these worlds through the eyes of those who inhabited them day by day. Across these vastly different landscapes of time and place, a common, undeniable thread emerges: the fundamental, often relentless struggle for basic survival, securing adequate food to ward off hunger, finding durable shelter against the harshness of the elements, maintaining health in the face of limited medical understanding, ensuring safety from violence or accident, and simply mustering the energy needed for demanding daily labor. These concerns consumed the vast majority of time and resources for most people throughout much of history. Life was frequently precarious, lived with uncertainties and vulnerabilities we can scarcely imagine today. Yet, while the struggle was constant, the specific nature of the challenges varied immensely with the era and environment. Medieval life was intimately bound to the rhythms of agriculture, the success of the harvest dictating feast or famine, with daily life structured by seasonal tasks and religious obligation. Roman urban life presented different pressures, navigating extreme population density, relying on complex systems for water and food distribution, contending with widespread slavery as a social and economic reality. The Industrial Revolution introduced yet another set of hardships: the discipline of the factory clock, the dangers of unregulated machinery, the unprecedented scale of urban pollution, and the social upheaval accompanying mass migration. Underlying all these distinct experiences was the profound absence of comforts, conveniences, and safeguards that we now consider utterly normal, often taking them entirely for granted. Imagine enduring the biting cold of winter without any form of central heating or effective insulation, or the oppressive heat of summer without fans or cooling systems. Picture facing a serious illness or infection without access to antibiotics or understanding of germ theory, or enduring the agony of a broken bone or toothache without effective painkillers or reliable dentistry. Consider the immense labor involved in obtaining clean water daily, the lack of safe sanitation, the absence of instant communication, widespread literacy, or social safety nets against disaster. And yet, amidst these undeniable and often overwhelming hardships, people endured. The human spirit proved remarkably resilient. People adapted to their specific environments, developed intricate social customs and support networks, found solace and meaning in religious faith, family bonds, or community rituals. They innovated within their technological and material constraints, passed down essential skills and knowledge through generations, celebrated small joys, mourned losses, and simply carried on with the business of living. There is a quiet, persistent strength evident in the continuation of everyday life across these difficult eras. In the seemingly boring details we've explored, the specific ways they cooked, clothed themselves, worked, and socialized, speak volumes about this enduring human capacity to adapt and persist. Perhaps reflecting on these past lives allows us a quiet moment to appreciate the often unseen fabric of ease and security woven into our own daily existence. The simple act of turning on a tap for instantly available safe drinking water, flicking a switch for reliable light and power, accessing effective medicine for common ailments, choosing from an unprecedented abundance and variety of food, communicating instantly with loved ones across vast distances, or resting securely in a comfortable, climate-controlled home. These commonplace miracles represent the culmination of centuries of human effort, ingenuity, scientific advancement, and hard-won struggles. Our everyday boring often rests peacefully upon the foundation of their extraordinary and frequently unrecorded endurance. So as we conclude this journey through different landscapes of the past, let the stories of everyday survival settle gently in your mind. Understanding the challenges faced by those who came before us doesn't diminish the richness or complexity of their lives, nor does it negate the problems we face today. Rather, perhaps it offers a deeper perspective on the long arc of human experience and fosters a quiet gratitude for the present. The grand narratives of history often focus on kings, empires, and revolutions, but the quiet, persistent rhythm of ordinary people, simply living, working, adapting, and enduring day by day, forms the true, deep current of our shared human story. May this glimpse into their world bring a sense of quiet appreciation for the long road traveled, and perhaps contribute now to a peaceful and well-deserved rest